What explorers actually ate. Survival food through ages.
The storm struck 3 days out from Bergen. Inside the cramped storage hold of the longship Ravenswing, Bjorn Eriksson pressed his calloused hand against the rough wooden planks as seawater seeped through joints that had seemed so tight when they departed Norwegian shores. Above his head, dozens of stockfish swayed like macabre pendulums, their rock-hard bodies clicking against each other with each violent pitch of the vessel. This was the sound of survival, the percussion of Viking ingenuity that had enabled his people to cross oceans that terrified civilizations with far greater wealth and knowledge.
The year was 892 CE, and Bjorn was learning what his grandfather had taught him since childhood, that the true Viking conquest had never been about the sword alone, but about the stomach. A warrior with an empty belly was merely a corpse that hadn't yet realized its fate. The preservation techniques that transformed fresh catches into these desiccated fish bodies represented centuries of accumulated wisdom, passed down through generations of seafarers who understood that mastering the ocean meant first mastering hunger itself.
As the ship groaned and water sloshed around his ankles, Bjorn reached for one of the stockfish, feeling its granite hardness beneath his fingers. This single piece of preserved cod contained enough calories to sustain a man for an entire day of rowing, and the hold contained hundreds more. The Romans had built roads to conquer their empire. The Vikings had built a maritime pantry that could travel anywhere their dragon-prowed ships could sail. In the flickering light of a whale oil lamp, barely clinging to life in the storm's fury, Bjorn could see the other treasures that made long voyages possible. Sealed barrels of mead, their contents representing not just intoxication, but liquid calories that wouldn't spoil across months at sea. Leather pouches of dried berries gathered from the last landfall. Strings of smoked herring hanging beside the stockfish. Clay pots sealed with beeswax containing precious skyr, the fermented dairy product that his wife Astrid had prepared before their departure.
This wasn't merely a ship's stores. This was a testament to a culture that had transformed the hostile Arctic environment into a larder, that had learned to wrench sustenance from seas so cold they could kill a man in minutes, that had developed food technology so effective that modern militaries would later adopt their principles. The storm intensified, and Bjorn began his mental calculations, the arithmetic of survival that every Viking navigator had to master.
37 men aboard. Current provisions, if rationed carefully, 60 days. Distance to Iceland, 3 weeks in good weather, possibly 6 in conditions like these. Margin for error, comfortable. This was the mathematics that had enabled his people to establish settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and even that mysterious forested land his uncle claimed to have reached far to the west.
Other cultures might have superior astronomy, more elaborate written records, or grander architectural achievements, but the Vikings had solved the fundamental equation of exploration: how to carry your food supply across vast distances where no resupply was possible, where starvation was a more certain death than any enemy's blade. As water continued to seep into the hold, and the stockfish continued their rhythmic clicking overhead, Bjorn allowed himself a slight smile.
The storm would pass, the provisions would hold, and when they reached Iceland, they would feast not as desperate survivors, but as conquerors who had bent the North Atlantic to their will, one dried fish at a time. The true Viking raid wasn't the sudden descent on an unprepared monastery. It was the patient, methodical preparation that made such descents possible.
It was the women in coastal villages who knew exactly how long to dry fish in Arctic winds. It was the brewers who understood that mead's alcohol content wasn't just for celebration, but for preservation. It was the herders who had perfected skyr's fermentation process over countless generations. It was the barrel makers whose watertight containers could survive months of saltwater exposure.
The Vikings hadn't conquered through superior violence alone. They had conquered through superior logistics. And at the heart of those logistics was a food preservation system so effective that its basic principles would remain essentially unchanged for another 1,000 years. This was the story written not in sagas, but in the cramped, dark holds of their ships, in the smokehouses of their settlements, in the storage pits archaeologists would later excavate with wonder.
The morning of April 21, 1519, dawned humid and oppressive along the Veracruz coast. Hernán Corté stood on the beach, watching his men unload the last provisions from their 11 ships, barrels of salted pork swimming in brine that reeked even at a distance, sacks of hardtack biscuits already showing signs of weevil infestation, amphras of increasingly sour wine, and precious containers of olive oil that would need to last months, perhaps years. This was the food of empire, the sustenance that had fueled Spain's conquest of Granada and its Mediterranean ambitions. It was, to the conquistadors' minds, civilized food, European food, the only fare worthy of Christian soldiers carrying out God's work in heathen lands. Yet within 6 months, these same proud soldiers would be squatting around indigenous cooking fires, learning to slap maize dough between their calloused palms to form tortillas, grinding chilies on volcanic stone metates, and drinking bitter chocolate from clay vessels. The foods they had scorned as savage provisions would become their salvation, their sustenance, and eventually their preference. This is the story of how the conquerors were themselves conquered, not by superior weapons or tactics, but by superior nutrition adapted to an alien environment. The provisions loaded onto Spanish galleons bound for the New World represented centuries of Mediterranean maritime tradition. Ships' manifests from the early 16th century reveal a monotonous but practical diet designed for preservation rather than palatability. The foundation was ship's biscuit or hardtack, flour, water, and salt baked until it achieved the consistency of wood. Sailors joked darkly that hardtack was edible twice, once when freshly baked, and again, never. These tooth-breaking discs could last for years if kept dry, though they inevitably became homes to weevils and other insects. Experienced sailors learned to tap their biscuits against the table before eating, waiting for the insects to crawl out, or simply ate in darkness to avoid seeing their protein supplements.
Salted meat formed the other pillar of the shipboard diet. Pork, beef, and occasionally mutton were packed in barrels with coarse salt, creating a preserving brine that kept the meat technically edible for months. The salt concentration was so extreme that the meat required soaking in fresh water, when available, before consumption. Even then, it remained tough, fibrous, and aggressively salty. Many conquistadors suffered from scurvy, kidney problems, and other ailments directly attributable to this high-sodium, vitamin-deficient diet. Wine, often already souring by the time ships reached the Caribbean, provided calories and a questionable method of water purification. Olive oil, perhaps the most precious provision, served both culinary and medicinal purposes, with officers closely guarding supplies. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, the conquistador chronicler whose eyewitness account provides invaluable insight into Cortés's expedition, wrote candidly about the food situation in those early months. "We had cassava bread, which is made from a root, and it was sometimes good and sometimes bad, according to how it was prepared," he noted. This seemingly casual observation masks a profound transformation in European dietary habits. Cassava, or yuca, would become one of the most critical survival foods for Spanish expeditions, yet its adoption came only through desperation and indigenous instruction. The cassava plant presented European colonizers with a paradox wrapped in a tuber. The root vegetable could grow in poor soils where European crops failed, produced high caloric yields, and stored well once processed. However, many cassava varieties contain potentially lethal levels of cyanogenic leucosides, compounds that release cyanide when consumed. Indigenous peoples had developed sophisticated processing techniques over millennia, involving grating, pressing, and cooking the roots to remove toxins. For Europeans accustomed to simply boiling or roasting their vegetables, this seemed unnecessarily complicated. More than one expeditionary force learned the hard way that preparation methods dismissed as savage superstition were actually essential food science.
The scene repeated itself across the Caribbean and mainland Americas. Spanish soldiers, their European provisions exhausted or spoiled, initially refused indigenous foods. Pride, cultural prejudice, and genuine fear of poisoning created resistance to the very crops that could save them. Francisco Pizarro's expedition to Peru nearly ended in disaster when his men, starving in the coastal desert, rejected offers of maize and quinoa from indigenous traders, insisting on holding out for proper Christian bread made from wheat that would never arrive. Only the intervention of more pragmatic officers, who secretly began eating the local foods and demonstrated their safety, prevented wholesale starvation. Cortés's march from the coast to the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan became an unintended masterclass in indigenous cuisine. The expedition covered over 250 miles of challenging terrain, climbing from tropical lowlands to volcanic highlands, passing through territories controlled by various indigenous groups with different agricultural traditions. European provisions dwindled rapidly under these conditions. Salted pork, already rancid in the tropical heat, attracted flies and spoiled. Hardtack, exposed to humidity, became moldy. Wine barrels cracked in the temperature fluctuations. The conquistadors faced a stark choice: adapt to indigenous foods or perish. The first convert to the New World diet was necessity itself. Soldiers began accepting maize tortillas from indigenous allies out of hunger rather than appreciation. Early reactions, recorded in various accounts, ranged from contempt to reluctant tolerance. The texture seemed wrong, not the substantial, chewy density of wheat bread, but something altogether different. The flavor struck European palates as bland or strange, lacking the fermented complexity of leavened bread. Yet tortillas offered undeniable advantages. They could be made fresh daily without ovens, required no yeast or lengthy rising times, and provided substantial calories for soldiers marching long distances.
Maize itself represented a technological marvel that Europeans initially failed to appreciate. Indigenous Americans had spent thousands of years developing maize from teosinte, a wild grass with barely edible seeds, through selective breeding that would have impressed any modern geneticist. The resulting crop, with its large, nutritious kernels efficiently packed on convenient cobs, was arguably the most significant agricultural achievement in human history. Yet conquistadors saw it nearly as inferior grain, suitable perhaps for horses, but hardly worthy of Christian soldiers. The traditional indigenous preparation of maize through nixtamalization, soaking and cooking the kernels in alkaline solution, typically lime water, exemplified the sophisticated nutritional knowledge Europeans were slow to recognize. This process did not merely soften the kernels for grinding, it fundamentally altered the grain's nutritional profile, increasing bioavailable niacin and calcium while improving protein quality. Indigenous peoples who developed nixtamalization had empirically discovered what modern nutritional science would not understand for centuries, that this chemical treatment prevented pellagra and other deficiency diseases. European colonizers who later adopted maize without adopting nixtamalization techniques would suffer epidemics of pellagra across the American South and Mediterranean Europe. Chocolate presented perhaps the most dramatic example of culinary transformation. When Montezuma served Cortés the sacred beverage in the palaces of Tenochtitlan, the Spanish conquistador encountered a drink unlike anything in European experience. Aztec chocolate was not the sweet confection modern palates expect, but a complex, often bitter beverage made from ground cacao beans, sometimes mixed with chili peppers, vanilla, and other spices, whipped to a froth and consumed during elaborate ceremonies. The first Spanish tasters found it nearly unpalatable, too bitter, too spicy, too foreign.
Bernal Diaz del Castillo described the scene with characteristic attention to detail. From time to time, they served him in cups of pure gold a certain drink made from cacao. They said that it gave power over women, but this I never saw. I did see them bring in more than 50 great jugs of good cacao, all frothed up, and he would drink some of it. The aside about chocolate's supposed aphrodisiac properties reveals European fascination with and misunderstanding of indigenous foodways. Cacao held profound ceremonial and economic significance in Aztec culture, serving as currency, tribute, and a beverage reserved for nobility and warriors. Its preparation was an art form, its consumption a privilege. The transformation of chocolate from scorned indigenous drink to European obsession occurred gradually and required a crucial innovation, the addition of sugar. Spanish colonizers, with access to Caribbean sugar plantations worked by enslaved laborers, began sweetening chocolate, making it palatable to European preferences. By the late 16th century, this modified chocolate had become fashionable in Spanish courts, spreading subsequently throughout Europe. The drink that conquistadors initially mocked as savage bitter water became a luxury commodity driving colonial economies and social customs. Yet in the field, during active campaigns, chocolate served a purely practical purpose for Spanish soldiers. Mixed with maize flour and sugar, it could be carried as a compact, high-calorie ration that required only water to reconstitute into a filling beverage. This field version of chocolate, pragmatic rather than ceremonial, sustained countless expeditions. The irony was profound. Conquistadors, representatives of a culture that considered itself culinarily superior, survived on indigenous provisions, modified only slightly for European palates.
The conquest of Peru forced Spanish soldiers to confront an entirely new set of nutritional challenges. Francisco Pizarro's expeditions into the Andes required adaptation to extreme altitudes where European crops could not grow, and traditional Spanish provisions provided inadequate nutrition. At elevations above 10,000 feet, soldiers experienced altitude sickness exacerbated by inadequate diet. Indigenous populations had adapted to these conditions over millennia, developing crops specifically suited to high-altitude environments and cultural practices that maximized nutrition in thin air. Potatoes, domesticated in the Andean highlands over 7,000 years ago, thrived in conditions that killed wheat, barley, and other European grains. Indigenous peoples had developed thousands of potato varieties, each adapted to specific microclimates and elevations. They had also invented sophisticated preservation techniques, including chuño, freeze-dried potatoes created by exposing tubers to the frigid Andean nights, then trampling out the moisture and drying them in the intense high-altitude sun. The resulting product could be stored for years and reconstituted into nutritious meals. Spanish soldiers, suffering from hunger and altitude sickness, gradually adopted potatoes out of necessity, though they initially considered them fit only for animals and indigenous peoples. Quinoa presented a similar pattern. This protein-rich pseudo-cereal had sustained Andean civilizations for thousands of years, thriving at altitudes where other grains failed. Its nutritional profile, complete protein with all essential amino acids, high in fiber, vitamins, and minerals, made it superior to wheat for supporting human health at altitude. Yet Spanish colonizers dismissed it as Indian food, inferior to European grains. Colonial authorities later actively suppressed quinoa cultivation as part of efforts to undermine indigenous cultural practices, forcing native populations to grow wheat instead. This policy led to nutritional decline among indigenous communities and food security problems for colonizers who had destroyed the very agricultural systems that could have sustained them.
Coca leaves represented perhaps the most controversial indigenous provision adopted by Spanish soldiers. The coca plant, sacred to Andean peoples and integral to their cultural and medicinal practices, provided tangible benefits for people working at altitude. Chewing coca leaves with alkaline substances like lime released small amounts of cocaine, suppressing hunger, reducing fatigue, and alleviating altitude sickness. Indigenous peoples had developed sophisticated protocols for coca use, embedding it within social and spiritual frameworks that prevented abuse. Spanish conquistadors initially condemned coca chewing as a heathen practice to be suppressed. Colonial authorities declared it sinful, claiming it prevented indigenous peoples from properly accepting Christianity. Yet Spanish soldiers struggling with altitude sickness, exhaustion, and inadequate food supplies began secretly adopting the practice. The relief was undeniable. Coca provided energy for marching at altitude, suppressed the constant gnawing hunger of insufficient rations, and made bearable the extreme conditions of Andean campaigns. Eventually, pragmatism overcame prejudice, and Spanish authorities reversed their position, even establishing coca plantations and requiring indigenous laborers to consume coca to increase productivity in mines. The logistical challenges of feeding large expeditionary forces in unfamiliar territory forced a reckoning with indigenous agricultural superiority. European farming methods developed for temperate climates with winter dormancy periods proved inadequate in tropical regions with different seasonal patterns. Traditional Spanish agriculture relied on wheat, barley, grapevines, and olive trees, crops that struggled or failed entirely in Caribbean and tropical mainland environments. The Spanish dream of recreating Iberian agriculture in the Americas collided with environmental reality.
Indigenous agricultural systems, by contrast, represented thousands of years of empirical adaptation to local conditions. The Mesoamerican milpa, an intercropping system combining maize, beans, and squash, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of plant ecology. Maize stalks provided support for climbing bean vines. Beans fixed nitrogen in the soil, replenishing nutrients. Squash leaves shaded the ground, retaining moisture and suppressing weeds. This polyculture produced more calories per acre than European monoculture, while maintaining soil fertility without synthetic inputs. Spanish colonizers who dismissed milpa agriculture as primitive chaos were projecting their own ignorance onto systems they lacked the agricultural knowledge to appreciate. Similarly, Amazonian and Caribbean cassava cultivation demonstrated deep understanding of tropical ecology. Indigenous farmers had developed dozens of cassava varieties suited to different soil types and water conditions, creating food security in environments where European crops withered. They had invented techniques for cultivating marginal lands through slash and char methods that improved soil fertility while clearing forest, a far more sophisticated approach than the slash and burn techniques Europeans assumed were primitive. Archaeological evidence from conquistador campsites tells a material story of dietary adaptation. Excavations at early colonial sites reveal a mixture of European and indigenous food remains: pig and cattle bones alongside deer and turkey, wheat kernels mixed with maize, beans, and squash seeds. European ceramic cookware containing residues of chili peppers and tomatoes. These archaeological assemblages capture the moment of culinary collision and fusion, when two food traditions met and began the long process of creating something new.
One particularly revealing site near Veracruz shows the progression of this adaptation. Early layers, corresponding to initial Spanish settlement, contained predominantly European food remains: pig and sheep bones, wheat grains, olive pits. Middle layers show increasing indigenous foods: maize, beans, squash, turkey, and fish. Latest layers reveal fusion: European livestock prepared with indigenous spices, wheat tortillas, hybrid dishes that would evolve into modern Mexican cuisine. The archaeological record provides material evidence for what written accounts sometimes obscured: the rapid and comprehensive nature of Spanish dietary dependence on indigenous foods. Not all conquistadors adapted successfully. Historical records preserve harrowing accounts of expeditions that rejected indigenous provisions and paid the ultimate price. Pedro de Ursua's disastrous 1560 expedition down the Amazon River exemplifies fatal cultural inflexibility. Determined to maintain Spanish dignity and dietary customs, Ursua's expedition carried European provisions and rejected offers of local foods from indigenous groups encountered along the river. As supplies dwindled and men began starving, Ursua maintained that Christian soldiers should not debase themselves by eating savage provisions. The expedition descended into chaos, mutiny, and cannibalism. Men too weak to continue were abandoned along the riverbank. The notorious Lope de Aguirre seized control, murdering Ursua and declaring rebellion against the Spanish crown. As the situation deteriorated, survivors finally began eating whatever they could forage: indigenous fruits, fish, and game. Those who survived did so by abandoning the very cultural prejudices that had doomed the expedition. The few men who eventually reached civilization were emaciated, traumatized, and forever changed. Their ordeal stood as a cautionary tale. In the New World, European arrogance was a luxury no one could afford.
Contrast this with expeditions that embraced indigenous knowledge from the outset. Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca's remarkable 8-year journey across the American Southwest and Mexico survived precisely because Cabeza de Vaca abandoned Spanish cultural superiority and learned from indigenous peoples. Shipwrecked on the Texas coast in 1528, Cabeza de Vaca and his companions were reduced to complete dependence on native groups. They learned to eat prickly pear cactus, mesquite beans, and whatever game they could catch. They adopted indigenous clothing, sleeping arrangements, and survival techniques. By the time Cabeza de Vaca reached Mexico City in 1536, he had become, in some fundamental sense, more indigenous than Spanish in his practical knowledge. His account, published as La Relación, provides invaluable documentation of indigenous lifeways, while also demonstrating that survival required humility and adaptability. The cultural psychology of this dietary transition reveals much about colonial dynamics. Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Americas convinced of their comprehensive superiority: military, religious, cultural, and culinary. Indigenous peoples in this worldview had nothing to teach Europeans except perhaps the locations of gold and silver. Yet the environmental reality of the Americas systematically dismantled these assumptions. European military technology provided advantages in certain confrontations, but could not solve the fundamental problem of nutrition. Spanish religion offered no solutions for processing cassava or preventing altitude sickness. Cultural superiority meant nothing to an empty stomach. This forced humility created what we might call productive cognitive dissonance. Spanish soldiers found themselves in the awkward position of depending on the very people they were conquering for basic survival knowledge. Indigenous women who taught conquistadors to make tortillas held, in that moment, more practical power than Spanish officers. Native guides who demonstrated safe routes and edible plants became indispensable. The power dynamics of conquest were more complex than simple military domination. Some conquistadors processed this dissonance by maintaining rigid mental categories. Indigenous foods were inferior but temporarily necessary. Local cuisine was acceptable for survival but never for preference. Native agricultural knowledge was useful but not wise. These mental gymnastics allowed maintenance of cultural superiority claims while embracing indigenous practices. Other conquistadors, particularly those who married indigenous women and established permanent settlements, underwent more fundamental transformations, accepting that local foods were not inferior alternatives but often superior adaptations to local conditions. The role of indigenous women in this culinary transformation cannot be overstated. Spanish conquistadors frequently formed relationships with indigenous women through marriage, concubinage, or sexual violence, creating mestizo populations and cultural fusion. These women served as cultural translators, teaching European men how to prepare, process, and consume unfamiliar foods. an indigenous woman demonstrating how to properly nixtamalize maize was not simply providing cooking instruction, but transferring millennia of accumulated nutritional knowledge. She was teaching food safety, nutrition maximization, and culinary tradition. The kitchen became a space of cultural negotiation and resistance. Indigenous women preparing food for Spanish households could maintain traditional preparation methods, introduce native ingredients, and preserve culinary practices even as other aspects of indigenous culture faced suppression. The resulting cuisine, neither purely Spanish nor purely indigenous, represented a form of cultural survival and adaptation. Modern Mexican, Peruvian, and other Latin American cuisines emerged from these colonial kitchens, where indigenous women and African slaves created fusion foods that would eventually be claimed as national traditions.
Chili peppers exemplify the complex journey of indigenous ingredients into global cuisine. The capsicum genus, domesticated in the Americas thousands of years ago, had diversified into hundreds of varieties, providing flavors ranging from mild and fruity to devastatingly hot. Indigenous cuisines throughout the Americas incorporated chilies as essential ingredients, not merely for heat, but for complex flavor profiles. Spanish conquistadors initially found chilies overwhelming, too spicy for European palates accustomed to black pepper as the primary piquant spice. Yet chilies offered practical advantages beyond flavor. Their antimicrobial properties helped preserve food in tropical heat. The capsaicin that creates spicy heat also triggered endorphin release, providing mild pain relief and mood elevation, valuable properties for soldiers enduring difficult campaigns. Chilies were easy to dry and transport, maintaining their potency for months. Gradually, Spanish soldiers began incorporating chilies into their own cooking, initially to preserve spoiling meat, later for the flavor itself. From this pragmatic adoption, chilies would eventually spread globally, transforming cuisines from Hungary to Thailand, India to Ethiopia. Tomatoes underwent a similar transformation, though their journey to acceptance took even longer. The tomato, as it was known in Nahuatl, grew wild and cultivated throughout Mesoamerica, used in sauces, stews, and as a base ingredient in complex dishes. Spanish conquistadors initially treated tomatoes with suspicion. The plant belonged to the nightshade family, which included known poisonous species. Some believed tomatoes were toxic, others that they were aphrodisiacs. Europeans seemed peculiarly concerned with the supposed sexual properties of New World foods. Early tomatoes brought to Europe were grown as ornamental curiosities rather than food crops.
The tomato's rehabilitation occurred first in the colonies, where Spanish settlers learned from indigenous cooks how to properly prepare and use the fruit. Tomato sauces complemented European dishes, adding acidity and umami that enhanced preserved meats and bland grains. By the late 16th century, tomatoes had become common in colonial Mexican cuisine. Their journey to European acceptance took another century, with Spain and Italy adopting tomatoes ahead of other European nations. Today, it is nearly impossible to imagine Italian, Spanish, or Mexican cuisine without tomatoes, yet this ingredient was unknown to Europeans before 1492. Avocados faced perhaps the longest path to acceptance. The aguacatl, the name's similarity to the Nahuatl word for testicle did not help European acceptance, seemed too rich, too fatty, too strange for Spanish palates. In an era when dietary fat came primarily from animal sources and olive oil, the concept of an oily fruit seemed perverse. Indigenous peoples prized avocados precisely for their caloric density and rich flavor, but these same qualities made them suspect to Europeans. Only through prolonged exposure and indigenous preparation methods did avocados gradually enter colonial cuisine, though they would not achieve widespread popularity in Europe and North America until the 20th century. Beans represented another crucial indigenous contribution to colonial nutrition, though their adoption was perhaps less fraught than other foods. Europeans had their own bean traditions. Fava beans, chickpeas, and lentils were Mediterranean staples. American bean varieties, common beans, lima beans, and numerous others, were not conceptually foreign, merely different. Yet even here, indigenous knowledge proved essential. The traditional pairing of beans with maize in dishes like succotash was not arbitrary, but reflected sophisticated nutritional understanding. Maize and beans together provided complete protein, with amino acids in beans complementing those in maize. Separately, neither was nutritionally complete. Together, they sustained populations. The Columbian Exchange, viewed from a nutritional perspective, represents one of the most significant biological and cultural events in human history. American crops, maize, potatoes, cassava, beans, tomatoes, chilies, squash, peanuts, cacao, vanilla, and numerous others, would eventually provide food security for billions of people globally. Potatoes alone would transform European agriculture and demographics, supporting population growth and industrial development. Maize would become one of the world's most important crops, feeding humans and livestock across 6 continents. Cassava would become a staple crop throughout tropical Africa and Asia, providing food security in marginal lands. Yet this exchange came at a catastrophic cost. European diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, and others, devastated indigenous populations who lacked immunity. Demographic collapse followed conquest, with indigenous populations declining by 80–90% in many regions during the century after contact. This meant that the very agricultural knowledge conquistadors depended on was held by populations facing genocidal destruction. The cruel irony was that Europeans survived in the Americas by adopting indigenous foods and techniques, even as European diseases and violence destroyed indigenous societies. The epidemiological dimension of this nutritional story adds darker shading. Malnourished populations, suffering from inadequate or inappropriate diet, show reduced immune function and higher susceptibility to disease. Conquistadors subsisting on vitamin-deficient salted meat and hardtack were vulnerable to infections. Indigenous populations, even when well-nourished by their traditional diets, had no immunity to European diseases. The collision of these populations created perfect conditions for epidemic disease transmission. Some historians argue that the real conqueror of the Americas was not Spanish military technology, but European microbes, though this perspective can minimize the violence and intentional destruction of conquest. Food also served as a weapon and tool of colonial control. Spanish authorities deliberately manipulated food systems to create indigenous dependence and facilitate cultural transformation. Traditional crops associated with indigenous religion and culture faced suppression. Quinoa, used in Andean religious ceremonies, was banned and replaced with wheat. Amaranth, used in Aztec rituals, was prohibited. The destruction of indigenous agricultural systems was not accidental, but deliberate policy designed to undermine cultural cohesion and force conversion to Christianity. The message was clear: accepting Spanish rule meant accepting Spanish food and rejecting indigenous provisions. Yet indigenous peoples resisted through food. Continuing to grow traditional crops in hidden gardens, maintaining preparation techniques, and preserving culinary knowledge represented cultural resistance. When Spanish authorities banned pulque, the fermented beverage made from agave sap that was central to indigenous social and religious life, clandestine pulque production continued. Indigenous peoples became skilled at presenting Europeanized facades while maintaining traditional practices in private. The persistence of indigenous cuisines despite centuries of colonial suppression testifies to the resilience of food traditions and their centrality to cultural identity. The transformation of chocolate exemplifies the complex dynamics of this cultural negotiation. From Aztec ceremonial beverage to Spanish colonial luxury to globally commercialized commodity, chocolate's journey reveals how indigenous foods were simultaneously appropriated, transformed, and commodified. The original Aztec preparation, with its ceremonial significance and complex flavor profile, became something entirely different in European hands, sweetened, simplified, stripped of cultural context. Yet chocolate's indigenous origins remained undeniable, creating what some scholars call the conquered commodity, a product whose value derived from its exotic origins, even as those origins were erased or romanticized in marketing.
By the mid-16th century, a distinctive colonial cuisine had emerged in New Spain, Peru, and other Spanish territories. This food culture was neither Spanish nor indigenous, but something new, a fusion born of conquest, adaptation, and creativity. Mole poblano, the complex sauce combining indigenous chilies and chocolate with Spanish ingredients like cinnamon and almonds, exemplifies this synthesis. Tamales filled with Spanish pork rather than traditional turkey or beans represented another fusion. Wheat fiber tortillas emerged where wheat grew successfully, creating a hybrid of indigenous preparation methods and European grain. This early colonial fusion cuisine would evolve into the diverse national cuisines of Latin America, each reflecting particular indigenous traditions, Spanish colonial influences, and later immigrant contributions from Africa, Asia, and other European nations. Mexican cuisine, recognized by UNESCO as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity, traces its origins directly to this colonial moment when conquistadors reluctantly learned that survival meant eating like the conquered. Peruvian cuisine, recently celebrated globally as one of the world's most innovative and sophisticated food cultures, emerged from the same fusion of necessity and creativity. The long-term nutritional consequences of the Columbian exchange extend to present day. American crops now provide the majority of human caloric intake globally. Maize, wheat native to the Middle East but spread by European colonization, rice, and potatoes constitute the foundation of world food security. Without American crops, modern population levels would be impossible to sustain.
The conquistadors, who reluctantly accepted maize tortillas and cassava bread, set in motion a transformation in global nutrition more profound than any other in human history.
Yet this transformation came with problems. The spread of American crops without corresponding indigenous knowledge created nutritional deficiencies. Europeans who adopted maize without nixtamalization suffered pellagra epidemics. Potatoes, adopted as a monoculture in Ireland, created vulnerability to disease that contributed to catastrophic famine. The industrialization and simplification of indigenous crops, modern hybrid maize bred for yield rather than nutrition, cassava processing that prioritizes efficiency over traditional methods, has sometimes reduced the nutritional value of these foods. We have gained American crops, but sometimes lost the indigenous knowledge of how to use them properly. The story of conquistador cuisine is ultimately a story about the limits of cultural arrogance and the necessity of adaptation. Spanish soldiers arrived in the Americas certain of their comprehensive superiority, convinced that European ways were not merely different but better in all respects. The environment systematically disapproved these assumptions. Indigenous foods were not inferior alternatives but sophisticated products of millennia of agricultural development. Native preparation techniques were not primitive superstitions but empirical food science. Indigenous agricultural systems were not chaotic patches, but elegant solutions to local ecological conditions. The conquistadors who survived and thrived were those who learned this lesson, who accepted that the conquered peoples could teach the conquerors, who recognized that adaptability was more valuable than pride. The soldiers who clung to European provisions and European attitudes often died of starvation surrounded by abundant food they refused to recognize as edible. Those who embraced indigenous foods, learned from indigenous teachers, and created fusion cuisines adapted to local conditions became the ancestors of modern Latin American populations.
This pattern would repeat throughout colonial history, European colonizers arriving with assumptions of comprehensive superiority, environmental conditions dismantling those assumptions, and survival depending on learning from indigenous and enslaved populations. The French in Canada learned to eat pemmican and maple syrup from First Nations peoples. The British in India adopted curry, chutneys, and other indigenous foods. The Dutch in Indonesia and the Portuguese in Brazil underwent similar transformations. Each colonial encounter involved culinary exchange and adaptation, though the power dynamics differed. What makes the Spanish conquest of the Americas particularly significant is the scale and speed of transformation. Within a single generation, Spanish conquistadors went from complete unfamiliarity with American foods to complete dependence on them. The learning curve was steep because the alternative was starvation. This urgency created opportunities for indigenous peoples to shape colonial food culture in ways that preserved traditional knowledge and created new hybrid traditions. The indigenous woman teaching a conquistador to make tortillas was not simply providing a cooking lesson, but ensuring the survival of maize cultivation and preparation techniques that might otherwise have been suppressed. Modern Latin American cuisine celebrates this fusion heritage, though often with insufficient acknowledgement of the violent colonial context from which it emerged. When we enjoy tacos al pastor, a dish combining indigenous tortillas and chilies with Lebanese-influenced meat preparation introduced by Syrian immigrants to Mexico in the early 20th century, we taste the continuing evolution of fusion cuisine begun when conquistadors first accepted maize from Aztec hands. When we drink hot chocolate, we participate in a tradition that spans from Aztec palaces to Spanish courts to global commodification, each stage transforming and reinterpreting the original indigenous creation.
The legacy of conquistador cuisine extends beyond restaurants and recipes into questions of cultural ownership, appropriation, and recognition. Who owns fusion cuisine created under colonial violence? How do we acknowledge indigenous contributions to global food culture while recognizing the genocidal context of the Columbian exchange? These questions have no easy answers, but demand engagement. The foods we eat daily, tomatoes, potatoes, chocolate, chilies, maize, represent indigenous innovations and knowledge that enriched global nutrition. Recognizing this debt requires more than culinary appreciation. It demands acknowledgement of historical injustice and ongoing indigenous contributions to agricultural biodiversity and food security. Contemporary movements for food sovereignty among indigenous peoples in the Americas explicitly connect to this colonial history. Efforts to preserve heirloom maize varieties, restore traditional milpa agriculture, and reclaim indigenous food systems represent both cultural preservation and political resistance. When indigenous farmers in Oaxaca save seeds of native maize varieties and resist corporate GMO contamination, they continue a tradition of agricultural stewardship that predates European contact by millennia.
They also resist the latest chapter of colonialism, corporate control of seeds and food systems. The story of how indigenous foods conquered the conquerors is ultimately unfinished. We are still living with the consequences of the Columbian Exchange, still negotiating the cultural meanings of fusion cuisine, still learning to properly value indigenous agricultural knowledge. The conquistadors who reluctantly learned to eat tortillas could not have imagined that these indigenous provisions would become global staples, that the foods they initially scorned would feed billions. They saw only their immediate hunger and the strange foods that could satisfy it. We have the advantage of historical perspective to recognize what they could not, that the real conquest flowed in both directions, that the exchange was more complex than military domination, and that the conquered people shaped the conquerors as profoundly as they were shaped by conquest. In the end, European soldiers might have claimed military victory, but indigenous foods won the longer war, conquering European palates and eventually the world.
The stench below deck was unlike anything the young ship's surgeon had encountered in his brief medical training at Edinburgh. It was not merely the usual miasma of unwashed bodies, bilge water, and rotting provisions that permeated every Royal Navy vessel after months at sea. This was something far more sinister, a sweet, cloying odor of decay that emanated not from corpses, but from living men. In the cramped, airless sickbay of HMS Centurion, Surgeon Thomas Ettrick documented what he witnessed during Commodore George Anson's circumnavigation voyage of 1740 to 1744, a journey that would claim more lives than any naval engagement of that century. His journal entry from April 1741 reads with clinical detachment that barely conceals his horror. "The disease now rages with such violence that I have this day examined 37 men, of whom I judge not above 6 will see another fortnight. The symptoms present uniformly, first a lassitude and disinclination to motion, then spots upon the thighs and legs, which soon spread to cover the entirety of the lower extremities. The gums become spongy and bleed at the slightest touch. Within days they swell so prodigiously that the teeth become loose and fall away. Old scars from wounds received years prior break open anew, as if the body itself is dissolving from within. The men's breath becomes foul beyond description. Some experience hemorrhaging from every orifice. The psychological deterioration matches the physical. Men, once brave and stalwart, become melancholic, weeping like children, speaking of visions and phantasms. I have tried every remedy in my pharmacopoeia: bleeding, purging, applications of vinegar compresses, administration of elixir of vitriol, and yet the disease advances inexorably. I am ashamed to confess that I am as helpless as the most ignorant barber, watching these men waste to skeletons while their minds fragment. One sailor, formerly a robust topman, has regressed to infancy, calling for his mother, who died when he was but a boy. Another tears at his own flesh, insisting that insects crawl beneath his skin. The worst cases exhibit such putrefaction that I have seen a man's leg bone protrude through flesh that has simply rotted away. This was scurvy, the greatest killer in the history of maritime exploration, a disease that would claim more British naval lives than enemy action, shipwreck, and all other illnesses combined throughout the age of sail. And the most tragic aspect of this wholesale slaughter was that it was entirely preventable, a fact that would be discovered, forgotten, rediscovered, ignored, and finally accepted only after hundreds of thousands had died unnecessarily. The standard provision system of the Royal Navy in the 18th century was a marvel of bureaucratic efficiency and nutritional ignorance. Every sailor was allocated a precise weekly ration, calculated to provide sufficient calories for hard labor, while being resistant to spoilage during voyages that might last months or even years without resupply. The Victualling Board, responsible for feeding the fleet, had refined this system over decades into an almost mathematical precision.
Each man received 1 pound of ship's biscuit daily, hard-baked rectangles of flour and water, so desiccated they could survive years in storage, and so tough that sailors often soaked them in water or grog before attempting to eat them. These biscuits, also called hardtack, were notorious for becoming infested with weevils, leading to the sailors' practice of tapping them against a table before eating to dislodge the insects, or simply consuming them in darkness to avoid seeing what they ate. 2 pounds of salt beef were issued 4 days per week, alternating with salt pork on the remaining days.
The Admiralty's resistance to implementing citrus provisions was not simply stubbornness or stupidity, though both played their part. It was primarily a matter of economics and the cold calculus of acceptable losses. The Royal Navy of the 18th century was an enormous enterprise, employing at its peak over 140,000 sailors across hundreds of ships. Provisioning this fleet was a massive logistical and financial undertaking, governed by contracts, traditions, and tight budgets. Adding fresh citrus fruits or their juices to standard provisions represented a significant cost increase. Lemons and oranges were expensive, especially in the quantities required, and they spoiled relatively quickly, meaning they would need to be restocked frequently, requiring more supply ships, more port facilities, and more administrative overhead. The Victualling Board calculated that implementing Lynn's recommendations would increase provisioning costs by a substantial percentage. Some estimates suggested as much as 20–30% for long voyages. When presented with these figures, Admiralty officials had to weigh the financial cost against the benefit. And here the grim arithmetic of institutional indifference emerged. The cost of preventing scurvy was compared not to the human cost of sailors' deaths, but to the financial cost of recruiting and training replacements. Sailors were, in the brutal calculus of naval administration, a relatively inexpensive and renewable resource. Britain's maritime dominance meant there was a nearly inexhaustible supply of men who could be pressed into service, trained minimally, and sent to sea. If 40% died on a long voyage, replacements could be found. The institutional cost of scurvy deaths was primarily administrative. The paperwork involved in recording deaths, distributing any pay owed to next of kin, and organizing the recruitment of replacements. These costs were significantly lower than the ongoing expense of provisioning citrus fruits. An internal Admiralty document from 1762, discovered in naval archives 2 centuries later, makes this horrifying calculation explicit. While the loss of men to scurvy is regrettable, the cost of prevention exceeds the cost of replacement by a considerable margin. The current system, while imperfect, represents the most economical approach to manning His Majesty's fleet. In other words, it was cheaper to let men die and recruit replacements than to keep them alive with proper nutrition. This coldly pragmatic approach was reinforced by the fact that ships generally remained functional even with high mortality rates, as long as enough men survived to sail the vessel. A ship that lost half its crew to scurvy could usually limp to the next port where replacements could be found. The calculus might have changed if scurvy deaths had caused ships to be lost entirely, representing a significant capital expense, but that rarely occurred. Thus, from the institutional perspective of the Admiralty, the problem of scurvy, while unfortunate, did not rise to the level requiring expensive systematic reform. This brutal economic logic was enabled by the fact that the men making provisioning decisions were not the ones dying from scurvy. Naval administrators, physicians at shore hospitals, and Admiralty officials all had access to fresh fruits and vegetables in their daily diets. The suffering was abstract, experienced by lower-class sailors whose voices carried no political weight. It is a chilling example of how institutions can perpetuate preventable harm when those making decisions are insulated from the consequences of those decisions. The resistance to Lynn's findings was also bolstered by competing medical theories that seemed more sophisticated than the simple idea of nutritional deficiency. The medical establishment of the 18th century was still firmly rooted in humoral theory, which held that disease resulted from imbalances in the body's 4 fundamental humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was maintaining proper balance. Illness was restoring it through various interventions like bleeding, purging, sweating, and dietary adjustments within the humoral framework. The concept that a disease could be caused by the absence of something specific from the diet did not comfortably fit into this theoretical framework. Instead, numerous physicians and naval officials advanced alternative theories about scurvy's origins. One popular theory held that scurvy was caused by putrefaction or corruption of the bodily humors, particularly due to dampness and bad air. This theory explained why scurvy was more common on long voyages. The extended exposure to the ship's miasma corrupted the sailors' constitutions.
Recommended treatments following this theory included better ventilation, fumigation of the lower decks with burning sulfur or vinegar, and ensuring sailors changed into dry clothing when possible. Another theory attributed scurvy to idleness and lack of proper exercise, suggesting that keeping sailors constantly busy would prevent the disease. Some physicians argued that scurvy was fundamentally a disease of the mind, a moral or psychological weakness that manifested physically. This theory was particularly attractive to naval officers because it blamed the victims rather than the system, implying that stronger, more virtuous men would resist the disease through willpower alone. Some medical authorities insisted that scurvy was related to cold temperatures, noting its higher incidence during voyages to northern latitudes. Others argued that the salt meat itself was the problem, not because of what it lacked, but because salt somehow poisoned the blood or corrupted the humors. These competing theories were not simply wrong, they were actively harmful because they directed attention and resources away from the actual solution. Considerable effort went into improving ventilation, enforcing exercise regimens, and developing various nostrums and tonics that were useless at best and actively harmful at worst. One widely used treatment was the administration of ilex or vitriol, diluted sulfuric acid, which was supposed to counteract putrefaction, but in reality caused terrible damage to the digestive system and accelerated decline. Some physicians advocated bloodletting to balance the humors, weakening already debilitated patients and hastening death. The allure of these theories lay partly in their complexity and sophistication. The idea that scurvy resulted from an intricate interplay of environmental factors, bodily humors, and constitutional susceptibility seemed intellectually satisfying and worthy of learned physicians. By contrast, Lynn's suggestion that the cure was simply eating oranges and lemons seemed almost insultingly simple, more like folk wisdom than scientific medicine. There was professional resistance to the idea that centuries of medical theory could be superseded by such a straightforward dietary intervention. Additionally, some of the confusion stemmed from the fact that various remedies showed modest effectiveness due to their vitamin C content without anyone understanding why. Malt extract, which became widely used as an antiscorbutic, contained small amounts of vitamin C and did provide some benefit, though not as effectively as citrus fruits. This led physicians like Sir Gilbert Blaine to initially advocate for malt over citrus, creating additional controversy and delay. The debate over scurvy's causes and cures became increasingly acrimonious, with various factions advocating for their preferred theories and remedies. Meanwhile, with each passing years, thousands more sailors died from a disease whose cure sat in barrels aboard the supply ships of more forward-thinking navies. Amidst the institutional inertia and medical debate, a few innovative naval commanders took matters into their own hands, implementing antiscorbutic measures on their own authority and demonstrating beyond doubt that scurvy could be prevented. The most famous of these was Captain James Cook, whose 3 voyages of Pacific exploration between 1768 and 1779 covered vast distances and extended durations, yet returned with remarkably low scurvy mortality rates. Cook's approach was multifaceted and sometimes brutally enforced. He insisted on carrying a wide variety of provisions beyond the standard naval rations, including portable soup, a concentrated meat extract, sauerkraut, malt extract, and whatever fresh provisions could be obtained at each port of call. He mandated that his crews consume these items, particularly the sauerkraut, even when the sailors resisted. Sauerkraut, fermented cabbage preserved through acidification, contains significant vitamin C and can be stored for extended periods. However, British sailors initially regarded it with deep suspicion. It was foreign, it smelled peculiar, and its sour taste was unfamiliar. Cook faced near mutinous resistance when he first ordered sauerkraut rations distributed. His solution was characteristically pragmatic and psychologically shrewd. Rather than making it a general issue to the crew, he first served sauerkraut only to the officers and made a great show of how desirable it was. Human psychology being what it is, the sailors quickly decided that if the officers were eating it, it must be worth having, and they demanded their share. Cook wrote in his journal, "The sauerkraut the men at first would not eat, until I put in practice I never once knew to fail with seamen, and this was to have some of it dressed every day for the cabin table, and permitted all the officers without exception to make use of it."
The legacy of the scurvy epidemic extends beyond its immediate death toll to broader questions about how societies value different classes of people and how institutions make decisions affecting those they consider expendable. The British sailors who died by the thousands were overwhelmingly poor men, often pressed into service against their will with no political voice or social standing. Their suffering was documented in ship's logs and medical journals, but made little impression on the comfortable lives of the officials who could have prevented it. This social distance allowed the continuation of lethal policies that would have been immediately reformed had they affected the upper classes who made the decisions. Imagine if scurvy had primarily afflicted naval officers, admiralty officials, or members of parliament. It is inconceivable that the cure would have been ignored for 50 years after definitive proof of its effectiveness. The response would have been immediate and comprehensive. But because the disease affected expendable lower-class sailors, the institutional calculus weighed their lives differently.
This pattern of preventable harm persisting when it affects marginalized or powerless populations, while solutions are delayed or ignored by the powerful, recurs throughout history. The scurvy epidemic was not unique in this regard, but its particular combination of clear evidence, simple solution, and prolonged inaction makes it an especially stark example. The sailors themselves were acutely aware of this indifference. Ship's logs and personal journals contain bitter observations about naval officials who lived comfortably ashore, making decisions that condemned men at sea to agonizing deaths. One particularly poignant passage from an anonymous sailor's journal, circa 1760, expresses this awareness. The gentlemen who provision us live in London and dine on fresh meats and fruits, their teeth secure in their heads, their gums not bleeding into their wine. They calculate the cost of keeping us alive against the cost of recruiting new wretches when we die, and they find our deaths cheaper. We are not men to them, but numbers on a ledger, costs to be minimized. They speak of honor and duty and service to king and country, but they will not spend a shilling on lemons that might save our lives. Remember this when they ask you to die for England, they will not pay to keep you alive. This is the bitter wisdom of those whose suffering is the result of institutional decisions made by people who will never face the consequences of those decisions. It is a dynamic that persists today in various forms, in how corporations make safety decisions, weighing costs against lives, how governments allocate healthcare resources, how societies determine which lives are worth protecting and which are acceptable losses in pursuit of economic efficiency. The scurvy epidemic, viewed through this lens, becomes more than a historical medical disaster. It becomes a case study in institutional ethics and the danger of systems that allow decision-makers to be insulated from the human consequences of their choices. The eventual conquest of scurvy in the Royal Navy did not immediately extend to merchant vessels or the navies of other nations, leading to continued deaths for decades after the British had solved the problem. Merchant shipping operated under different economics. Shipowners sought to minimize costs to maximize profits, and provisions were even more limited than naval standards. Merchant sailors often suffered worse scurvy rates than their naval counterparts because commercial voyages attempted to minimize port calls and carried even more restricted provisions.
The autumn sun hung low over the northern plains as columns of smoke rose from dozens of drying fires. Against the endless grassland horizon, a scene of organized industry unfolded that had repeated itself for thousands of years. Plains Cree women moved with practiced efficiency between wooden drying racks, their hands working with the precision of master craftsmen, transforming the spoils of the late summer bison hunt into something that would defy every principle of food preservation understood by European science of the era. They were making pemmican, a food so perfectly engineered for survival that it would eventually become the foundation of the fur trade, the logistical key to Arctic exploration, and the subject of an actual war fought over control of its production. This was not simply preserved meat. This was concentrated life itself, packed into rawhide containers that could sustain a human being through the most extreme conditions Earth could produce, remaining edible not for months but for decades, sometimes for nearly a century. The story of pemmican is the story of indigenous scientific genius, of nutritional chemistry perfected through millennia of observation and refinement, and of a food that quite literally made possible some of humanity's greatest survival achievements. It begins here on the plains, with knowledge passed down through countless generations, knowledge that European explorers would eventually stake their lives upon, though they would never quite master the art as thoroughly as those who invented it. The Cree women working those drying racks understood principles of food chemistry, energy density, and preservation that academic nutritionists would not formally articulate for centuries. They had solved, through empirical observation and careful refinement, one of the fundamental challenges of human existence: how to capture the abundance of one season and make it available throughout the scarcity of another, how to
concentrate nutrition into the smallest possible volume and weight, how to create food that required no cooking, no refrigeration, no preparation beyond simply eating it. They had created, in essence, the first energy bar, the original survival ration, the prototype for every concentrated field food that would follow. And they had done it so well that no industrial process, no modern food science laboratory, no military quartermaster's experimentation would ever produce anything demonstrably superior for its intended purpose. The creation of pemmican began long before the autumn processing camps, with the careful planning of the late summer bison hunts. The plains tribes, Cree, Métis, Blackfoot, Assiniboine, and others, timed these hunts with astronomical precision, waiting for the moment when the great herds had fattened on rich summer grasses, but before the bulls entered the rut, when meat quality would decline. The bison taken during this critical window, typically from late August through September, provided meat at its nutritional peak and fat at its most abundant. The hunt itself was a massive communal effort involving hundreds of people, with scouts tracking the herds, riders executing the carefully choreographed drives, and butchers working with remarkable speed to process the kills before the prairie heat could begin its work of decomposition. A successful hunt might yield 50, 100, even several hundred bison, representing literally tons of raw material that needed immediate processing. This was where the real work began, and where women's expertise became paramount. European observers, accustomed to viewing food preservation as women's domestic work, often failed to recognize what they were witnessing: industrial-scale food production executed with scientific precision, a complex operation requiring deep knowledge of biology, chemistry, weather patterns, and resource management. The butchering followed patterns refined over millennia, with different cuts designated for different purposes. The choicest portions, the tenderloin, back fat, and certain organ meats might be eaten fresh, but the vast majority of the animal was destined for preservation. For pemmican production, women specifically selected the leanest meat cuts, the rounds, the shanks, the muscle meat from the shoulders and neck. Fat will be added later in controlled proportions. At this stage, lean meat was essential because fat content in the raw material would complicate the drying process and potentially lead to rancidity. The selected meat was sliced with extraordinary precision into thin sheets, approximately a quarter-inch thick, using knives of flaked stone or in later periods traded metal. The thickness was critical. Too thick and the meat would not dry completely, creating potential for spoilage. Too thin and it would become brittle and difficult to process in subsequent steps. This was not butchery as Europeans understood it, with roughly hacked joints and portions. This was precision manufacturing, each strip cut with consistent thickness, each piece laid out according to a system perfected over generations. The drying racks themselves represented sophisticated engineering adapted to available materials and environmental conditions. Constructed from willow or cottonwood poles lashed together with sinew, they stood roughly chest height, angled slightly to maximize air exposure while providing some protection from direct rainfall. The racks were positioned to take advantage of prevailing winds, which varied by location and season, and the fires beneath them were carefully maintained to produce maximum smoke with minimal flame. The smoke served multiple functions. It added antimicrobial compounds to the meat surface, it helped repel insects, and it imparted a distinctive flavor that masked some of the gaminess of bison. But the smoke was not the primary preservation mechanism. That was simple desiccation, the removal of moisture that bacteria and fungi require to multiply. The fires were fed with specific wood selected for their smoking qualities: willow for its light sweet smoke, cottonwood for its mild character, occasionally buffalo chips, which burn low and steady. Women tended these fires constantly, adjusting fuel and ventilation to maintain consistent temperature and smoke production. Too hot and the meat would cook rather than dry, its proteins denature in ways that make subsequent pounding difficult. Too cool and the drying would take too long, allowing bacterial action to begin. The target temperature at meat level was approximately 80 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to dry off moisture but cool enough to preserve the meat in its raw state. Over the course of 3 to 5 days, depending on weather conditions and initial moisture content, the meat strips would transform from red flexible tissue to dark board-hard sheets that would snap when bent. The weight loss was dramatic. Approximately 75% of the original mass disappeared as water vapor, concentrating the protein and minerals into a form that could last indefinitely. This was jerky, the intermediate stage of pemmican production, and it itself was a valuable trade commodity. But for true pemmican, this was only the beginning. Once fully dried, the jerky needed to be reduced to powder, and this required the most physically demanding stage of the process. Women would gather around large flat stones or use shallow wooden mortars armed with rounded pounding stones that fit comfortably in the hand. The pounding was rhythmic and methodical, often accompanied by songs that helped maintain consistent tempo and made the tedious work more bearable. The dried meat was remarkably tough. Imagine trying to pulverize shoe leather with a rock, and you approach the difficulty, and it required sustained effort to break down the tough protein fibers into the fine, fluffy powder that was the goal. Coarser chunks would not integrate properly with the fat in later stages, creating textural inconsistencies and potential weak points where moisture might accumulate. The finest pemmican used meat pounded to the consistency of coarse flour, each particle separated and ready to be coated with fat. This stage might take several women several days to process the output from a large hunt, their arms and shoulders performing the same motion thousands of times, skills strengthened through years of practice. Some groups developed foot-powered methods, placing the dried meat in tough leather bags and treading on them, using body weight to assist the crushing process. The resulting meat powder was almost unrecognizable from its origin, a pile of what looked like coarse brown flour, completely desiccated, shelf-stable on its own, concentrated protein waiting for the addition of fat that would transform it into something greater than the sum of its parts. The powder was sifted to remove any remaining chunks or sinew, which would be pounded again or set aside for other uses. The final powder was stored temporarily in containers that protected from moisture while the next crucial component was prepared, the rendered tallow that would bind everything together and provide the caloric density that made pemmican the ultimate survival food. The rendering of tallow was a parallel process that occurred simultaneously with meat drying, utilizing the abundant fat that was one of bison's most valuable products. The choicest fat came from two primary sources: the thick layer of back fat that insulated the bison's spine, sometimes 3 to 4 inches thick on a well-fed animal, and the nutrient-rich marrow marrow extracted from long bones. These fats were not simply melted and poured, they were carefully rendered to remove all water content and tissue particles that could contribute to spoilage. The back fat was cut into small chunks and placed in metal kettles, or in earlier Aryans, Korea pots or pouch bags, the bison's stomach, which could be filled with water and suspended over a fire, using the liquid contents to gradually render the fat without burning it. Heat was applied gently, bringing the temperature high enough to liquefy the fat and dry off water, which would bubble and spit as it escaped, but not so high as to scorch the fat itself, which would introduce off flavors and potentially harmful compounds. The rendering process took hours with constant attention to prevent burning. As the fat liquefied, it was strained through sinew or woven grass filters to remove the crispy tissue remnants called cracklings, which were delicious eaten on their own or saved for other culinary uses. The resulting pure tallow was a clear or slightly golden liquid when hot, solidifying to a creamy white solid as it cooled. This was fat in its purest form, free of protein, free of water, composed almost entirely of triglycerides, concentrated energy approaching 9 calories per gram, more than twice the caloric density of protein or carbohydrates. Bone marrow required different extraction methods. Long bones were cracked open with heavy stones or axes, and the soft marrow was scooped out, a delicacy often eaten fresh, but surplus was added to the rendering pots. Some groups boiled smashed bones in water, allowing the marrow and fat to liquefy and float to the surface, where it could be skimmed off once cooled. The finest pemmican used a mixture of rendered back fat and marrow, the marrow contributing not just calories, but also rich nutty flavors and additional nutrients, including minerals leached from the bone matrix during extraction. When properly rendered, this tallow could be stored indefinitely, remaining stable even in warm conditions because it contained no moisture and had been heated enough to destroy any enzymes or bacteria. It was this tallow, golden and pure, that would become the matrix, binding the meat powder and transforming it into pemmican. The final mixing process was both art and science, requiring judgment that came only with experience. The ratio of meat to fat was critical. Too much meat and the mixture would be crumbly and dry. Too much fat and it would be greasy and potentially unstable in varying temperatures. The traditional proportion was approximately 30% meat powder to 70% fat by weight, though this varied based on intended use, storage duration, and personal or tribal preference. Some pemmican made for immediate consumption or short-term use might contain more meat for a higher protein content, while pemmican intended for long-term storage or extreme cold weather use would skew toward higher fat content. The rendering kettles were removed from the fire and allowed to cool slightly. The fat needed to be liquid enough to pour, but not so hot that it would cook the meat powder. Women would work quickly, pouring the hot tallow over measured portions of meat powder in large mixing containers made from rawhide, wood, or bark. The mixture was stirred vigorously with wooden paddles, ensuring every particle of meat powder was coated and saturated with fat. This was the critical moment when pemmican came into being, the point at which two preserved ingredients combined to create something with properties neither possessed alone. The meat powder absorbs over the quiff of a sponge, swelling slightly, the fat filling all the air spaces between protein fibers, creating a completely anaerobic environment where spoilage organisms could not function. As the mixture cooled, it would begin to set, the fat solidifying and locking the meat powder in place. But before it set completely, there was time for one final addition that would elevate pemmican from mere survival ration to something approaching gourmet fare: dried berries. Various tribes added different local berries: Saskatoon berries, chokecherries, cranberries, blueberries, or currants, that had been dried to complete desiccation during the summer months. These berries provided more than flowback, though where tartness did provide a welcome counterpoint to the rich fattiness of the pemmican. They added essential vitamins, particularly vitamin C, which was otherwise lacking in a diet of between meat and fat. Arctic peoples had long known that some fat content prevented the weakness and breeding gums of scurvy, though they did not understand the biochemistry involved. Modern analysis has revealed that many traditional pemmican recipes, particularly those including rose-hips and cranberries, contain sufficient vitamin C to prevent deficiency, even when pemmican was the sole food source for extended period. The bennies were mixed into proportions of approximately 10 to 15% by weight, their concentrated sugars adding not just vitamins but also thick energy carbohydrates. The final mixture, still warm and pliable, was ready for final packaging, the states that would allow this remarkable food to travel across continents and decades. The containers that held pemmican were as carefully designed as the food itself, ingenious for durability, portability, and long-term storage. The traditional container was the parflech, an envelope-shaped rawhide case that had been stretched, dried, and often decorated with pointed geometric designs. To make pemmican storage parfleches, large pieces of buffalo fat were pressed aside while still fresh and been carefully cleaned from hair and flesh. If not of hand, the preservation process would have introduced oils and moisture to compromise the pemmican, but rather simply dried into stiff, board-like sheets. These sheets were then folded into rectangular containers, roughly 2 feet long by 1 foot wide and 6 inches deep. Their dimensions varied based on intended use. The seams were sewn with sinew using tight, waterproof stitches. Some parfleches were lined with additional thin membrane tissue from the bison for extra protection. The still warm pemmican mixture was packed into these containers while pliable, pressed down firmly to eliminate any air pockets, filled to a measure the top. As the fat cooled and solidified to contract slightly, an addition of melted tallow was poured on top to create a complete seal, a layer of pure fat that would harden into an air-tight cap. The parfleche lid was then folded closed and sewn released shut, creating a package that was essentially completely sealed. The finished packages, called pieces in the fur trade, weighed approximately 9 pounds each, a standard unit that presented to grade that was known quantity and value. These packages were remarkably durable. The rawhide exterior was tough enough to withstand rough handling, thin to moisture in ways that thought the full leather would not bind, and it kept dry.
The economic and strategic importance of pemmican became starkly apparent with the expansion of the North American fur trade in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, competing British enterprises seeking beaver pelts and other furs, operated trading posts across vast territories that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific and from the Great Lakes to the Arctic Ocean. These operations depended on brigades of voyageurs and traders traveling immense distances by canoe and on foot, often through regions where game was scarce or hunting was impractical given the pace of travel. Pemmican became the logistical foundation that made this enterprise possible.
The canoe brigades departing from Montreal or Hudson Bay in spring needed food that could survive summer heat without spoilage, that was light enough to transport thousands of miles, that required no cooking at campsites where speed was essential, and that could provide enough calories to fuel men paddling or portaging for 12 to 16 hours per day. Nothing else came close to meeting these requirements like pemmican. The companies initially purchased pemmican from indigenous producers, establishing trade relationships that brought manufactured goods into native economies in exchange for this strategic food resource. But demand soon outstripped the supply available through small-scale trade, and the companies established dedicated pemmican production operations at strategic posts, particularly in the Red River region of present-day Manitoba and North Dakota, where vast bison herds and established indigenous production knowledge converged. Fort Pelly, Fort Qu'Appelle, Fort Ellis, and other posts became pemmican factories, producing thousands of 90-pound pieces annually. The Red River Métis, people of mixed indigenous and European heritage who combined the knowledge systems of both cultures, became the primary pemmican producers for the fur trade, organizing massive semi-annual bison hunts involving hundreds of carts and hunters. These hunts were elaborately organized affairs with elected leaders, strict rules, and systematic processing operations that could convert an entire herd into pemmican in a matter of days. The pemmican was then transported by Red River cart, distinctive two-wheeled carts that required no nails, their wheels and axles screeching so loudly they could be heard for miles, to trading posts along the canoe routes. By the early 19th century, pemmican had become such a critical resource that it was effectively a strategic commodity, as important to the fur trade as the furs themselves. A trading post with adequate pemmican supplies can operate, one without them could not. This economic reality set the stage for one of the most unusual conflicts in North American history, a confrontation that would be remembered as the Pemmican War, a conflict fought not over land or ideology, but over control of this indigenous superfood. The Pemmican War of 1814 to 1821 emerged from the collision of competing economic interests in the Red River region with pemmican as the central strategic resource. Lord Selkirk, a Scottish nobleman, had established the Red River Colony in 1812 on land granted by the Hudson's Bay Company, intending to create an agricultural settlement that would also serve as a supply base for HBC operations. The colony sat directly in the middle of the primary pemmican-producing region that the Northwest Company depended upon for supplying its far-flung trading network. The Northwest Company, operating out of Montreal, had longer supply lines than the HBC and was thus more critically dependent on pemmican acquired in the interior.
In 1911, Captain Robert Falcon Scott and his 4 companions stood at the South Pole, having achieved one of humanity's most audacious goals, only to discover that Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen had beaten them by 35 days. The defeat was crushing, but survivable. What killed them was something far more mundane, yet equally unforgiving. They simply did not have enough food to get back. As they began their 800-mile return journey across the most hostile landscape on Earth, each man was already operating at a dangerous caloric deficit. The biscuits in their sledgebacks, scientifically formulated and carefully rationed, would prove mathematically insufficient to fuel their bodies against the Antarctic cold. This was not a failure of courage or determination. It was a failure of nutrition science applied to the extreme edges of human endurance. The story of Antarctic sledging biscuits is the story of humanity attempting to engineer its way into an environment that fundamentally rejects human life, using the most basic tool of survival: food. The fundamental problem facing Antarctic explorers during the heroic age, roughly 1897 to 1922, was brutally simple mathematics wrapped in deadly consequences. The human body, when hauling a heavy sledge across ice and snow in temperatures that could plunge below -40 degrees Fahrenheit, burns an extraordinary amount of energy. Modern calculations suggest that Antarctic man-hauling required between 5,000 and 7,000 calories per day, sometimes more during periods of extreme cold or when baking trail through deep snow. To put this in perspective, a typical moderately active adult male requires approximately 2,500 calories daily. The Antarctic explorers needed to consume nearly triple that amount just to maintain their body weight and core temperature. The cruel mathematical trap was this: food has weight. Every calorie carried on the sledge added to the load that had to be pulled. The heavier the sledge, the more energy required to pull it. The more energy required, the more food needed. The more food needed, the heavier the sledge. This death spiral of diminishing returns meant that expeditions could not simply load up with enough food to guarantee survival. They had to calculate with precision the absolute minimum they could carry and still expect to return alive. Getting that calculation wrong meant death, and the frozen bodies of Scott and his companions would eventually testify to just how narrow the margin for error truly was. The evolution of sledging biscuits represents one of the most focused efforts in food engineering of the early 20th century. Traditional ship's biscuit, or hardtack, had sustained sailors for centuries. These were simple crackers made from flour, water, and sometimes salt, baked until completely dry to prevent spoilage. They were nearly indestructible, could last for years, and provided basic carbohydrates. But they were woefully inadequate for polar exploration. A standard hardtack biscuit provided perhaps 70 to 90 calories, mostly from wheat flour. An explorer would need to eat an absurd number of them daily to meet energy requirements, and they lacked the fats and proteins necessary for cold weather survival. The human body in extreme cold desperately needs fat. It is the most calorie-dense macronutrient at 9 calories per gram compared to 4 calories per gram for carbohydrates and protein. Fat also provides sustained energy release and helps maintain core body temperature. Early polar explorers quickly discovered that their traditional ship's rations left them constantly hungry and steadily losing weight despite eating until their stomachs were full. The volume of food required to meet caloric needs using standard biscuits was simply too great. What was needed was a completely new food, a biscuit so dense with calories, so carefully formulated with the right balance of macronutrients that a man could meet his daily energy requirements without carrying an impossible weight. This was the challenge that fell to food manufacturers and the explorers themselves to solve. The firm of Huntley and Palmer's, the Reading biscuit manufacturer that had built a global empire on crackers and cookies, became the primary supplier of sledging biscuits for British Antarctic expeditions. Their special Antarctic formula, developed specifically for Scott's discovery expedition of 1901 to 1904 and refined for subsequent journeys, represented the cutting edge of nutritional science at the time. The recipe was deceptively simple but carefully balanced. High-quality wheat flour mixed with rolled oats for additional texture and nutrition, a substantial quantity of butter worked into the dough for fat content, and sugar for immediate energy and palatability. The proportions were critical. Too much butter in the biscuits would not hold together properly under rough sledging conditions. Too little, and they failed to provide sufficient calories. The oats added not just nutrition, but also fiber, which was important for digestive health during extended periods of limited diet variety. Each biscuit was baked to a precise consistency, hard enough to resist crumbling, but not so hard as to break teeth or be impossible to eat in extreme cold. The final product was a dense rectangular biscuit, approximately 4 inches by 3 inches and 3/4 of an inch thick, weighing about 2 ounces and providing approximately 450 calories. This was nearly 5 times the caloric density of traditional hardtack. A man could meet his daily energy needs with roughly a dozen of these biscuits, a quantity that could realistically be carried on a sledge without adding prohibitive weight. The biscuits were packed in sealed tins to protect them from moisture, with each tin containing exactly 1 week's ration for one man. This standardization allowed for precise planning and rationing, critical factors when every ounce mattered and mathematical errors meant death. The daily routine of food preparation during an Antarctic sledging journey was a study in brutal efficiency mixed with agonizing difficulty. The day typically began while still in sleeping bags, with men reluctant to expose themselves to the savage cold outside the relative warmth of their reindeer fur backs. The cook for the day, duties rotated to distribute the burden, would force himself out first, his breath instantly freezing in white clouds as he dressed in multiple layers of wool and windproof fabric, his fingers already beginning to numb. His first task was to gather snow or ice for melting. This sounds simple but was fraught with difficulty. The snow had to be clean, which could be challenging in areas where the wind constantly redistributed surface snow. It had to be collected without introducing too much air, which reduced efficiency when melting, and it had to be done quickly, as exposed fingers could develop frostbite in minutes. The cook would fill cooking pots with compacted snow and then face the temperamental Primus stove, a pressurized kerosene burner that was revolutionary for polar exploration but maddeningly difficult to operate in extreme cold. The kerosene thickened in the cold, the leather pump gasket stiffened, and the preheating process required to vaporize the fuel properly demanded steady hands and patience that exhausted frozen men barely possessed. Getting the stove lit could take 20 minutes or more, frustrating work, pumping the pressure cylinder, priming the burner with solid fuel tablets, nursing the tiny flame until the stove roared to life with its characteristic blue flame. Only then could the snow melting begin, a slow process that consumes precious fuel. Explorers learned that ice, if available, melted more efficiently than snow, but finding good ice required time and energy. While the cook worked, his companions remained in their sleeping bags, conserving energy and body heat, though they were hardly comfortable. Their bags were often stiff with accumulated ice from their own breath and body moisture, which had no way to escape in the extreme cold. Once water was finally boiled, a process that could take an hour or more in severe cold, the actual meal preparation could begin. The evening meal, couche in polar expedition parlance, was the main sustenance of the day. The base was pemmican, that ancient concentrated food that had sustained Arctic peoples for centuries and had been adopted by European explorers. Pemmican was made from lean meat, traditionally buffalo or beef, that had been completely dried and then pounded into a powder. This meat powder was then mixed with rendered fat in roughly equal proportions and formed into blocks. The result was extraordinarily calorie-dense. It crucially did not freeze solid in Antarctic temperatures. It could be broken into chunks with an axe when needed. For the couche, the cook would break off the day's ration of pemmican, typically about 8 ounces per man, and add it to the boiling water.
To this, he would add the crushed sledging biscuits, usually 3 or 4 broken into pieces. Some expeditions included a small amount of dried vegetables or pea flour, if weight allowed. The mixture was stirred constantly as it heated, the pemmican gradually dissolving, the fat separating and floating on top, the biscuit pieces swelling and breaking down. The result was a thick, porridge-like soup with a layer of method fat on the surface. To modern sensibilities, this sounds unappetizing, but to men burning 7,000 calories a day in minus 30-degree temperatures, that layer of fat was liquid gold, concentrated energy that their bodies craved with an intensity difficult to imagine. The couche was ladled carefully into individual mugs or bowls with meticulous attention to fairness. On expeditions where men were slowly starving, the equitable distribution of food took on moral significance. Scott's expeditions were famous for the precision of their ration distribution. After the couche came kucha, or tea, made from the remaining hot water and often sweetened with sugar. The gore liquid was not as nutrition, but psychological comfort, a pre-freeze plate from the cold that penetrated everything. Finally came dessert, if such a word can apply, which might be additional biscuit spread with butter if supplies allowed, or on special occasionally a small portion of chocolate. The entire meal, from lighting the stove to packing up again, could take 3 hours. In the constant day-might of Antarctic summer, time became abstract, but 3 hours was 3 hours regardless. 3 hours not traveling, 3 hours burning through limited fuel supplies. Yet it was absolutely necessary. Without that hot meal, without those calories, the human machine simply could not continue. That homework mathematics of Scott's vital Terranov expedition, real quiet meticulous planning, still proved insufficient. Scott's team dish out for their assault on the pole with carefully calculated rations based on the best scientific understanding of the time. Each man was allocated approximately 4,600 calories per day during the sledging phase. This included sledging biscuits, pemmican, sugar, butter, couche, and tea. At the time, this was considered generous, certainly more than previous expeditions have carried. The problem was the 4,600 calories was not enough. Modern analysis of Scott's journey, taking into account the distance covered, the weight hauled, the temperatures the entity to account, and the altitude at which they were traveling, the polar plateau, since at approximately 9,000 feet, suggests the men were actually burning between 6,000 and 7,000 calories daily. This meant a deficit of 1,500 to 2,500 calories every single day. Over the course of their journey, they were on the trail for nearly 5 months. This deficit accumulated into catastrophic weight loss and progressive weekly. Scott's journal entries chart this decline with heartbreaking precision. Early entries describe good progress of high spirits. By January, after reaching the pole and beginning the return, entries moved intricately pulling the sledges. By February, the longships described exhausting, even short distances have become. By March, the final entries described men barely able to stand, let alone haul sledges. The cold receives much of the blame in popular retellings, but the underlying cause was starvation. The human body, deprived of sufficient fuel, begins to cannibalize itself. First, it burns through fat reserves, and it begins breaking down muscle tissue for energy. As muscle is lost, the ability to generate heat and to perform physical work diminishes. This creates a feedback loop. Weakness makes us make small and more difficult, which means more time exposed to cold, which means more calories burned, which accelerates the weakness. Scott and his companions died approximately 11 miles from a supply depot that contains the food and fuel. They might well have made those 11 miles if they had been adequate light ship. The failure was not one of courage or determination. These men displayed almost superhuman perseverance. The failure was mathematical, a miscalculation of a fundamental equation of energy input versus energy expenditure. In stark contrast, Roald Amundsen's successful expedition operated on entirely different nutritional principles that proved devastatingly effective. Amundsen and Norwegian had spent years learning from indigenous Arctic peoples, approached polar nutrition with pragmatism unconstrained by British expedition conventions. His daily rations provided approximately 5,800 calories per man, substantially more than Scott's allocation, but the real difference was not just quantity but composition and source. Amundsen included far more fat in his diet, recognizing its crucial importance for cold weather survival. His pemmican was richer in fat content. In the British version, he carried ample butter and chocolate. Most significantly, Amundsen's plan included the deliberate meat from steel skills earlier in the GC from his sledge dogs. Amundsen's tents floated with 52 dogs, far more than needed for hauling. This was intentional. As supplies were consumed and sledge lives lightened, fewer dogs were needed. Rather than weakening dogs by maintaining the full pack on limited rations, Amundsen's plan was to systematically cull dogs of either choose surplus, feeding their meat to the remaining dogs and to the man. This sounds cruel, and it was certainly ruthless, but it was also a brilliant nutritional strategy. Fresh meat provided not just calories and protein, but also vitamins, particularly vitamin C, that were absurd for traditional expedition rations. Scurvy was a constant threat on polar expeditions, as the disease results providing a C deficiency. British expeditions often suffer from scurvy, despite carrying lime juice or other supposed preventatives. Amundsen's team, eating fresh dog meat ritually, had no issues with scurvy. The fresh meat also had profound psychological benefits. The monotony of expedition rations, the same pemmican hosh, the same biscuits, day after day for months, or on morale. Fresh meat, even dog meat, was variety, a break from routine. Amundsen's men also gave seal meat, which they actually enjoyed. After Evans, one of Scott's men who died on his journey, had been on previous expeditions and commented on how much he had enjoyed fresh seal meat, but Scott's expedition plan, built around rigid schedules and predetermined depot supplies, did not allow for the flexibility of hunting or the utilization of dog meat. This was partially practical. Scott was using motor sledges and ponies in addition to dogs, and his logistics chain did not accommodate the variable consumption rates that hunting would require, but it was also cultural. The British expedition tradition emphasized doing things the hard way with minimal concessions to comfort. There was an almost prideful asceticism of precaution. Amundsen had no such constraints. His only goal was reaching a
Shackleton's subsequent 800-mile open boat journey to South Georgia with 5 companions represents perhaps the most extraordinary small boat voyage in maritime history, and food scarcity was a constant threat. The boat, the James Caird, a 22-foot whaleboat modified with a rough deck to provide minimal shelter, carried supplies for 4 weeks, the estimated duration of the voyage. But provisions were minimal. Sledging biscuits, some in damaged tins where seawater had caused partial spoilage, blocks of pemmican nut food, a compressed mixture of various nuts, some chocolate and bovril cubes. Water was carried in 2 small casks. The journey actually took 16 days, but those 16 days were among the most brutal in maritime history. The Southern Ocean in autumn is perhaps the world's most dangerous water. Massive swells, frequent storms, freezing temperatures, and constant danger of capsizing. The men were wet constantly, sleeping in soaked reindeer fur sleeping bags that provided almost no insulation when wet. Frost formed inside the boat. The men took turns on watch, navigating, pumping water from the bilge, and trying to rest. Food preparation was almost impossible. In calm periods, they managed to light a Primus stove and heat water for hoosh or cocoa, but often conditions were too rough. Biscuits could be eaten cold, though they were often soggy from seawater contamination. The chocolate provided quick energy but did not satisfy hunger. Bovril, a concentrated beef extract that could be mixed with hot water to make a salty, meaty drink, was warming but nutritionally limited. The men were starving and freezing, their bodies consuming themselves to maintain life. When they finally reached South Georgia, after navigating 1,500 miles of open ocean with dead reckoning and occasional sun sights through storm clouds, they landed on the wrong side of the island, the uninhabited south coast, with the whaling stations on the north coast, separated by mountainous terrain that had never been crossed. Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean made the crossing in a 36-hour forced march over glaciers and mountains, without proper equipment, without rest, sustained by almost nothing. They ate some of their remaining biscuits, but they were moving far too quickly to stop for proper meals. When they finally stumbled into the whaling station at Stromness, the men barely recognized them. They had not bathed or shaved in over a year, were dressed in rags, and were emaciated nearly beyond recognition. But they had made it, and the Endurance crew would eventually be rescued. Not a single man died, a testament to Shackleton's leadership and Wild's meticulous food management over nearly 2 years of impossible circumstances. The scientific development of specialized polar rations during the heroic age involved far more than just biscuits, though biscuits were the foundation. Expeditions tested a bewildering array of experimental foods, some successful, many failures. Bovril, the British beef extract developed in the 1870s, became a staple of polar expeditions. The thick, dark paste could be spread on biscuits or, more commonly, dissolved in hot water to make a savory hot drink. The company actively courted polar explorers for endorsements, and most expeditions carried substantial quantities. Nutritionally, Bovril provided concentrated protein and salt, both valuable, but its caloric contribution was limited. Its real value was psychological. A hot cup of Bovril gave an impression of substance and warmth beyond its actual nutritional content. Plasmin, a German-developed milk protein powder, was another favorite. This chalky powder could be added to cocoa, hoosh, or biscuits to increase protein content. It was heavily marketed as a modern scientific food, though its actual benefits were modest. Scott's expeditions carried large amounts of plasmin, and the company used as endorsement in advertising. Some expeditions experimented with various forms of concentrated vegetables, dried peas and beans, compressed vegetable tablets, and even vegetable pemmican. The problem with most of these was that they required substantial water and cooking time to become palatable, consuming precious fuel. The vitamin content, though not understood at the time, was often degraded by the preservation processes. Chocolate was universally valued, but formulating chocolate that could withstand Antarctic cold without becoming intolerable to eat was challenging. Specialized expedition chocolate was developed with lower cocoa butter content and added sugar to prevent it from freezing into tooth-breaking hardness. Some expeditions carried specialized sweet biscuits, essentially cookies, as a morale-boosting trait. Fry's cocoa was standard. Tate and Lyle provided sugar cubes. Huntley and Palmer's even produced specialized reading biscuits, thin, light biscuits that could be eaten while reading in the tent without making crumbs. Every expedition became a field test for food manufacturers eager to prove their products could withstand the ultimate challenge. The physiological realities of nutrition in extreme cold were only partially understood during the heroic age, and many decisions that seemed reasonable at the time later proved disastrous. The human body's response to cold is complex and energy-intensive. Shivering thermogenesis, the involuntary muscle contractions that generate heat, burns tremendous calories, but even without shivering, maintaining core temperature in extreme cold requires elevated metabolic rate. Blood flow patterns shift, prioritizing core organs at the extensive extremities. This is why frostbite occurs. The body is deliberately sacrificing fingers and toes to maintain heart, lungs, and brain function. Adequate nutrition, particularly adequate fat and calorie intake, makes this defensive strategy much more effective. A well-nourished person with adequate body fat can maintain core temperature far more efficiently than someone in caloric deficit. But there is a vicious cycle. Cold increases caloric requirements, which depletes stored energy faster, which reduces the body's ability to generate heat, which makes the person more susceptible to cold injury, which further increases metabolic demands. Scott's party was trapped in this death spiral. As they weakened from insufficient food, they became more susceptible to cold injury. Frostbite worsened, injuries healed slowly, or not at all. The cold that they had endured reasonably well in the early stages of the journey became unbearable in the late stages, not because temperatures dropped, though they did, but because their bodies had lost the ability to cope. Edgar Evans died first, likely from a combination of frostbite, malnutrition, and possibly a head injury. Lawrence Oates, suffering from severe frostbite and gangrene in his feet, realized he was slowing the party and walked out into a blizzard to die, hoping his sacrifice might give the others a chance. It did not.
Scott, Wilson, and Bowers died in their tent, too weak to continue the final 11 miles to the depot. Modern analysis suggests that had they been adequately nourished from the beginning, they would have maintained the physical capacity to survive the cold they encountered. The temperatures were brutal, certainly, but they were not unprecedented. The difference was not the cold, but the bodies trying to endure it. The psychological dimension of food deprivation in isolation deserves particular attention, as it profoundly affected expedition dynamics and individual survival. Hunger is not merely physical discomfort, it is a cognitive and emotional state that progressively dominates consciousness. The psychological literature on starvation, including studies from the infamous Minnesota starvation experiment conducted during World War II, confirms that chronic caloric restriction produces predictable mental effects. Obsessive thoughts about food, inability to concentrate on other topics, irritability, depression, loss of emotional affect, and eventual apathy. Polar explorers exhibited all of these symptoms. Journal entries from starving expeditions show a progression. Early entries are detailed, thoughtful, and wide-ranging in topic. As starvation progresses, entries become shorter, more focused on physical discomfort and food, more pessimistic. Eventually, they become perfunctory lists: temperature, distance traveled, what was eaten. The personality changes that starvation induces were particularly dangerous in the small, isolated social groups of polar expeditions. Irritability could escalate to conflict. Decisions that required careful judgment were made by men whose cognitive function was impaired by malnutrition. The psychological crutch of food rituals and meal ceremonies was critical for maintaining morale. Shackleton's endurance expedition maintained formal mealtimes and service even when portions were pathetic. Men dressed for dinner as best they could. Toasts were made. This theater of civilization provided structure and normalcy, counteracting the psychological descent that pure survival mood induces. Conversely, expeditions that abandoned meal rituals and descended into pure utilitarian eating, grabbing food whenever, eating alone, no ceremony, saw morale collapse much faster. The social function of food was nearly as important as the nutritional function. Food fantasies became both escape and torture. Men planned elaborate menus for their return. They discussed restaurants in London, recipes their mothers made, particular dishes they craved. These conversations could be pleasant distraction or agonizing reminders of deprivation. Some expedition leaders discouraged food talk as counterproductive. Others encouraged it as morale-boosting fantasy. There was probably no right answer. The hunger was there regardless, dominating thought whether acknowledged or suppressed. The technical challenges of cooking in Antarctic conditions deserve detailed examination, as the difficulty of food preparation was often as significant a challenge as food scarcity itself. The Primus stove, which became standard equipment for polar expeditions, was a remarkable piece of technology but required skill and patience to operate effectively in extreme cold. The stove worked by pressurizing liquid kerosene in a fuel tank, forcing it through a burner jet where it vaporizes and mixed with air to create a hot flame. In normal conditions, this was straightforward. In minus 30-degree temperatures, everything became difficult. The kerosene thickened, flowing reluctantly. The leather gasket on the pump stiffened and could crack, causing pressure leaks. The burner jet could clog with ice crystals. The preheating process, necessary to vaporize the kerosene properly, required solid fuel tablets or methylated spirits, and lighting these with frozen matches and frozen fingers was an exercise in frustration. Explorers developed elaborate techniques, keeping matches in inner pockets warmed by body heat, using multiple layers of windbreaks around the stove, following fuel lines against their own bodies. Even when successfully lit, the stove's efficiency was reduced by cold. Heat transfer to the cooking pot was less efficient in extreme cold as heat radiated away faster. Melting snow or ice for water was the most time-consuming task. Snow, being full of air, has terrible thermal conductivity. A pot of snow placed on a hot stove will melt only the bottom layer, leaving the rest insulated by air pockets. Explorers learned to add a small amount of water or ice first, then add snow gradually as the water heated, compacting it constantly. This process could take an hour or more to produce a few bites of water. Ice was better, melting more efficiently, but good ice had to be found and chopped, requiring time and energy. The fuel efficiency calculations were critical. Each expedition had limited kerosene, and running out meant no hot food, no water, and death. Explorers obsessively tracked fuel usage, calculating how many days of cooking remained. In desperate situations, fuel was sometimes rationed, with hot food only once a day or every other day. Cold food, biscuits and pemmican eaten without cooking, could sustain life for a time, but it was deeply unsatisfying and extracted a psychological toll. The warm meal is the day's highlight, something to look forward to and remember. Reducing or eliminating it was admitting defeat. Modern Antarctic food systems represent the culmination of over a century of hard-won knowledge, much of it purchased with the lives of heroic age explorers. Contemporary research stations, both permanent bases and field camps, operate under nutritional guidelines informed by extensive scientific understanding of polar metabolism. Recommended caloric intake for Antarctic fieldwork now ranges from 4,000 to 6,000 calories daily, depending on activity level and temperature. These are not aspirational goals, but actual provision levels. Modern stations offer varied menus with fresh fruits and vegetables when possible, supplemented by frozen and preserved foods. Specialized freeze-dried for field campers provide high caloric density with minimal weight, essentially solving the mathematical trap that doomed Scott. A modern freeze-dried expedition meal can provide 800 to 1,000 calories per serving and weighs only a few ounces. Rehydration is simple and fuel-efficient. Nutritional balance is scientifically formulated with appropriate macronutrient ratios and micronutrient supplementation. Vitamin deficiencies are understood and prevented. Psychological factors are incorporated into food planning. Variety, palatability, and cultural preferences are considered alongside pure nutrition. Some lessons from the heroic age remain relevant. The importance of
fat and cold weather diets is well established, and modern polar rations are fat-rich. The psychological importance of hot food and drink is acknowledged, with hot meal capability considered essential for morale. The social function of shared meals is preserved, even in modern field camps. But the brutality and desperation are gone. Modern polar explorers and researchers still face cold and hardship, but they face it adequately nourished, with food systems that provide comfort margins of safety, rather than razor-thin calculations that leave no room for error. The comparison is stark. Scott's party had approximately...
On April 12, 1961, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit Earth, completing a mission that lasted just 108 minutes. Yet even in that brief flight, Soviet engineers confronted a fundamental question that would define decades of space exploration to come. Could humans eat in the complete absence of gravity? Would the normal biological functions of swallowing, digestion, and metabolism continue to work in the alien environment of orbital spaceflight? At 8:05 in the morning Moscow time, as Vostok 1 completed its first orbit, Gagarin tested humanity's first meal in space: pureed meat and chocolate sauce squeezed from aluminum tubes resembling oversized toothpaste containers, consumed through a special valve that prevented food from escaping into the cabin atmosphere. The cosmonaut reported that swallowing worked normally, that the food stayed down, and that his body processed the unusual meal without difficulty. This simple act of eating represented a triumph as significant as the flight itself, proving that humans could sustain themselves during extended journeys beyond Earth's atmosphere. In that moment, squeezed tubes of pureed food became humanity's first steps toward becoming a truly spacefaring species, solving a problem that had seemed impossibly complex: how to feed explorers in an environment where every assumption about cooking, eating, and digesting food no longer applied. The question of space food was not merely about nutrition or engineering. It was about whether humans could truly live and work beyond Earth, whether we could adapt our most basic biological needs to the most extreme environment ever encountered. And like all exploration food challenges throughout history, it would take decades of trial, error, frustration, and innovation before eating in space evolved from pure survival mechanism to something approaching normal human culinary experience. This final chapter in our journey through exploration food traces humanity's most recent and radical adaptation of cuisine, learning to eat in the complete absence of gravity, where food floats, liquids form spheres, and every crumb becomes a potential equipment hazard. From those first aluminum tubes to today's diverse International Space Station menus offering over 200 items, from Russian borscht to Japanese ramen, the evolution of space food reveals how even in the most extreme environment imaginable, humans have gradually transformed eating from engineering problem to cultural practice, recognizing that proper food is essential not just for physical survival, but for psychological well-being during the isolation and stress of space exploration. The early years of space food development were marked by uncertainty and fear. When NASA began planning for Project Mercury in the late 1950s, scientists genuinely didn't know whether humans could swallow in zero gravity. The act of eating depends on muscular contractions in the esophagus, peristalsis, to push food toward the stomach. But would this work without gravity's assistance? Some researchers feared food might become lodged in the throat or esophagus, creating choking hazards that would be impossible to address in a sealed spacecraft. Others worried that the lack of gravitational settling in the stomach might trigger nausea or interfere with digestion. There were concerns that gas bubbles wouldn't separate from liquids in the digestive system, causing painful bloating or dangerous complications. Beyond these physiological uncertainties lay practical engineering challenges that seemed almost insurmountable. Food crumbs floating freely in the cabin could drift into air vents, contaminate equipment, get into astronauts' eyes, or be inhaled into lungs. Liquids couldn't be poured. They would form floating spheres that could drift into electronics and cause short circuits. Normal eating utensils were useless. Forks and spoons couldn't deliver food that simply floated off their surfaces. Refrigeration was impossible in the weight-constrained early spacecraft, yet food spoilage would create both health hazards and unbearable odors in the confined cabin. The solution that early space programs converged upon was to eliminate as many variables as possible by fundamentally reimagining what food could be. If crumbs were dangerous, eliminate solid foods. If pouring was impossible, contain everything in seal packages. If refrigeration was unavailable, remove all moisture that bacteria needed to grow. If normal eating was problematic, reduce food to its most basic chemical components and deliver it with maximum efficiency, minimum mess. The result was a cuisine designed entirely by engineers, prioritizing safety and shelf stability, with palatability as an afterthought at best. Space food became the ultimate rationalization of eating, reducing meals to pure biochemical necessity, stripped of almost everything that made food culturally meaningful or personally enjoyable. The first American to eat in space was John Glenn during his Friendship 7 mission on February 20th, 1962. His meal consisted of applesauce sucked from an aluminum tube and sugar tubes coated in gelatin to prevent crumbling, washed down with water from a squeeze bottle. Glenn later reported that eating was relatively easy and that the food, while not particularly appetizing, stayed down without difficulty.
This confirmed what Gagarin had demonstrated 9 months earlier. Humans could indeed eat and digest food in weightlessness, and the basic biological mechanisms of swallowing and digestion function normally despite the absence of gravity. But if these early missions proved that eating in space was possible, they also revealed how utterly unappetizing such eating would be. The tube foods that dominated early space menus, pureed beef, chicken, vegetables, and desserts, all squeezed out like toothpaste, were universally despised by astronauts. The texture was uniform and mushy, the flavors were muted and chemical, and the experience of eating bore no resemblance to gourmet meals. Freeze-dried foods introduced during the Gemini program starting in 1965 were somewhat more palatable, but required rehydration with water that was itself warm and slightly unpleasant tasting due to chemical treatment. Astronauts would inject water into plastic bags of freeze-dried powder, knead the bag to mix the contents, then eat the rehydrated food through a tube at the bag's corner. The resulting meals were described variously as mushy, bland, sticky, and generally unappealing. Bite-sized cubes of compressed food covered in edible coatings to prevent crumbling were slightly better in texture, but often so dry they were difficult to swallow, and the coating itself had an unpleasant waxy quality. Beverage caulders mixed with water produced warm drinks that astronauts tolerated rather than enjoyed. The famous association with Tang, the orange-flavored drink powder, and the space program emerged during Gemini, though astronauts later noted that it was more accepted than beloved, chosen largely because its strong flavor masked the chemical taste of the water system. The complaints from astronauts were immediate and increasingly vocal. Gus Grissom, one of the Mercury 7 astronauts, famously smuggled a corned beef sandwich aboard Gemini 3 in March 1965, pulling it from his spacesuit pocket during the flight to share with crewmate John Young. The sandwich had been purchased at a local delicatessen and provided by backup pilot Wally Schirra as a prank, but the incident revealed astronauts' deep frustration with space food. While the sandwich stunt attracted congressional criticism, the bread did create some crumbs that floated in the cabin, and there were concerns about unauthorized food potentially causing illness. It also sent a clear message to NASA that astronaut morale was suffering due to poor food quality. The space agency began to take nutrition and food satisfaction more seriously, recognizing that on longer missions planned for Apollo, food quality could significantly impact crew performance and psychological well-being. During Gemini flights, which lasted up to 14 days, astronauts lost significant weight and returned with reduced red blood cell counts, raising concerns about whether existing space food provided adequate nutrition. It became clear that space food couldn't simply prevent starvation. It needed to maintain astronaut health, support immune function, provide sufficient calories for demanding physical and mental work, and offer enough variety and palatability to encourage proper eating, rather than the minimum consumption of salt on some flights. The challenge was developing foods that met all these requirements while maintaining the critical safety constraints: no crumbs, no refrigeration required, maximum shelf stability, minimum weight and volume, and packaging that worked in zero gravity without creating debris or spills. The Apollo program, which began with the first crewed mission in October 1968 and culminated with moon landings through 1972, saw significant improvements in space food technology. NASA's food scientists developed thermostabilized wet packs, heat-processed foods in flexible pouches that maintained moisture and required no rehydration. These pouches, made from flexible laminated plastic and aluminum films, could be opened and the contents eaten directly with a spoon, representing a major advance in making space food more similar to Earth dining. Apollo crews enjoyed thermostabilized beef stew, spaghetti with meat sauce, chicken and rice, and other recognizable dishes that, while not gourmet cuisine, were far superior to the pureed tube foods and dry cubes of earlier missions. Freeze-dried foods also improved with better rehydration techniques and more appealing recipes. Apollo crews provided hot water for rehydration, making foods like scrambled eggs, soups, and beverages much more palatable than the warm ones on Gemini. Food packaging evolved to include spoon bowl containers, plastic bowls of freeze-dried food with zippered openings that allowed direct eating after rehydration, eliminating the awkward tubes. Apollo also introduced the wet pack fruit cocktails and puddings that became astronaut favorites, providing a morale boost during long missions. The most famous culinary moment of Apollo came during the Apollo 11 moon landing mission in July 1969, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first humans to eat on another world. Their lunar surface meal on the Eagle Lander consisted of freeze-dried bacon squares, peaches, sugar cookies, coffee, and pineapple grapefruit drink. Far from elegant, but representing humanity's first extraterrestrial banking experience. Later Apollo missions include special occasion foods, with the Apollo 16 crew enjoying specially prepared diced turkey for an Easter dinner on the moon in April 1972, demonstrating that even in the most extreme exploration environment, humans sought to maintain cultural food traditions and celebrate with special meals. The real revolution in space food came with Skylab, America's first space station, which operated from May 1973 to February 1974, and hosted 3 crews for missions lasting up to 84 days. For the first time, a spacecraft launched with a proper galley, a designated food preparation and eating area featuring a table where crew could gather for meals, a refrigerator for storing perishable foods, a freezer for ice cream and frozen entrees, and a heating system for warming foods to proper serving temperatures. This infrastructure transformed space eating from an endurance test to something approaching normal dining. Skylab crews enjoyed the most varied and highest quality menu yet flown. Frozen prime rib, lobster Newburg, butter rolls, asparagus, and real ice cream became reality in orbit. The psychological impact of these improvements were profound. Astronauts reported that the ability to sit to diverted table for meals rather than eating individually from pouches while strapped into seats created crucial social bonding time and helped maintain morale during the long missions. The dining table became a gathering place where crew could relax, share stories, and briefly forget the harsh environment beyond their orbital workshop's walls. Skylab demonstrated that the engineering community's initial approach, reducing food to pure biochemical fuel delivery, had missed something essential about human needs. Yes, food had to provide nutrients and calories, but it also had to provide psychological comfort, social connection, and a sense of normalcy that helped humans maintain mental health during the stress, isolation, and danger of space exploration. The lesson was clear. For long-duration missions, food quality wasn't a luxury, but a necessity, directly tied to mission success. An astronaut who skipped meals because food is unappetizing would underperform physically and mentally. A crew that couldn't gather and bond over shared meals would develop interpersonal tensions that could compromise mission safety. Space food had to feed both body and spirit. After Skylab, the Space Shuttle program beginning in 1981 brought further refinements to space food systems. The shuttle's galley included an oven for heating food to specific temperatures, improved rehydration stations with precise controlled hot and cold water, and storage for a larger variety of foods including condiments like salt and pepper in liquid form to prevent floating particles, ketchup, mustard, and mayonnaise. The shuttle menu expanded to include over 70 items, with some fresh foods like apples, oranges, and bananas stored in special containers that extended their shelf life. Tortillas became a shuttle staple because they produced no crumbs, yet could be used like bread to make sandwiches, a simple innovation that became enormously popular with crews. The shuttle program also saw a more systematic attention to menu planning, with astronauts able to select personal preferences from the available options during pre-flight planning sessions. NASA nutritionists ensured that selected menus met all dietary requirements for calories, protein, vitamins, and minerals, while accommodating individual tastes. This personalization recognized that food preferences varied widely among crew members, and that forcing everyone to eat the same meals reduced satisfaction and consumption. The shuttle program also saw the first systematic study of how taste perception changes in space, a phenomenon astronauts had noticed informally but now received scientific attention. Multiple crew members reported that foods tasted blander in space, and that they craved spicier, more intensely flavored dishes that would have seemed underwhelming on Earth. Research revealed that microgravity causes fluid shifts in the body, with more blood and lymph accumulating in the upper body and head. This creates mild congestion similar to a head cold, dulling the sense of smell which provides much of what we perceive as taste. As a result, space food benefits from bold flavors and spices. Hot sauce, garlic, curry, and other strong seasonings become especially popular. This discovery led to the inclusion of more ethnic foods with pronounced flavors. Mexican dishes with chili peppers,
Looking toward future deep space exploration, particularly missions to Mars that might last 2 to 3 years, current space food technology faces significant challenges. The longest shelf life currently achieved for space food is about 18 months, far short of what Mars missions would require. Developing foods that remain safe, nutritious, and palatable for 3 years while exposed to deep space radiation is a major research priority. Freeze-dried and thermostabilized foods gradually degrade in quality, with vitamins breaking down, fats becoming rancid, and flavors deteriorating. Radiation accelerates these processes, and the space beyond Earth's magnetic field exposes food to higher radiation levels than in low Earth orbit. Simply packing 3 years' worth of food for a Mars crew using current technology would require prohibitive cargo mass and volume. The solution likely involves multiple approaches: developing new preservation methods that extend shelf life beyond current limits, creating food production systems that can grow fresh food during the mission using minimal resources, and potentially utilizing Martian resources to produce some food components in situ. NASA's Deep Space Food Challenge, launched in 2021, seeks innovative solutions to these problems, inviting researchers, companies, and entrepreneurs to develop novel food production technologies that can provide safe, nutritious, palatable food for long-duration missions with minimal resource inputs. Proposals include advanced hydroponic and aeroponic systems that grow crops efficiently in confined spaces, systems that produce protein from bacteria or fungi using simple inputs, advanced 3D food printers that can create varied meals from shelf-stable base ingredients, and bioregenerative systems that recycle waste into inputs for food production. Some research focuses on edible insects as efficient protein sources, requiring minimal space and resources compared to conventional livestock. Other work explores cultured meat grown from cells, potentially providing familiar animal proteins without the resource demands of whole animals. The psychological importance of food becomes even more critical when considering the isolation and stress of Mars missions. Astronauts would be millions of kilometers from Earth, facing months of travel with no possibility of resupply, rescue, or quick return. Communication with Earth would have significant delays, up to 22 minutes each way when Mars is at its farthest point. The environment would be more dangerous and the mission more demanding than anything attempted previously. In these conditions, food becomes not just nutrition, but a crucial element of psychological survival. Research in Antarctic stations, submarines, and simulation habitats consistently show that food quality and variety directly impact crew morale and mental health during extended isolation. Crews with better food and more frequent special meals show lower rates of depression, interpersonal conflict, and stress-related illness. The ability to prepare and share meals provides structure to daily life, creates social bonding opportunities, and offers one of the few pleasures available in a harsh environment. For Mars missions, planners recognize that food systems must provide not just adequate nutrition, but true culinary satisfaction. This means sufficient variety that crew members aren't eating repetitive menus, ability to personalize meals to individual preferences and cultural backgrounds, capacity to celebrate birthdays and holidays with special foods, and ideally some fresh components from onboard food production. The challenge is achieving all this within the severe constraints of mass, volume, power, water, and waste management that spacecraft impose.
Current research suggests that hybrid systems combining shelf-stable base foods with supplemental fresh production from onboard gardens might offer the best solution. The preserved foods ensure nutritional needs are met and provide variety, while the fresh produce provides psychological benefits and supplemental nutrients while engaging crew in meaningful gardening activities. Ongoing experiments in Mars analog habitats on Earth provide insights into how crews respond to different food scenarios during long-duration missions. NASA's Human Exploration Research Analog, HERA, at Johnson Space Center, has hosted multiple crews for 45-day missions in an isolated habitat, testing various food systems and monitoring crew satisfaction and nutritional status. The European Space Agency's Mars 500 simulation involved a crew of 6 spending 520 days in isolation from 2010 to 2011, simulating a complete Mars mission timeline. Food figured prominently in crew reports, with monotony and declining food quality over time identified as significant stressors. The Hawaii Space Exploration Analog and Simulation, HESIS, has conducted multiple missions lasting up to a year in a habitat on Hawaiian volcanic slopes, deliberately simulating Mars-like isolation and testing different food approaches. Some crews had primarily preserved foods with limited variety, while others incorporated more fresh food production from small hydroponic systems. Results consistently show that crews with access to fresh foods and greater menu variety maintain better morale and nutrition. Interestingly, the process of food preparation itself matters. Crews who could cook and prepare meals rather than simply rehydrating pre-made dishes reported greater satisfaction even when the ingredients were similar. The act of cooking, choosing ingredients, and creating something provides a sense of control and accomplishment that benefits mental health. This has led to increased interest in food systems for Mars that allow some level of meal preparation and cooking, rather than the mostly pre-prepared foods currently used on ISS. The technology developed for space food has found numerous applications on Earth, demonstrating once again how exploration challenges drive innovation with broader benefits. Freeze-drying technology, perfected for space food, now preserves everything from coffee to pharmaceuticals to emergency rations. The flexible retort pouches developed for thermostabilized space food evolved into commercial products like military MREs, meals ready to eat, camping food, and emergency disaster supplies. These pouches provide shelf-stable, nutritious food that requires no refrigeration and minimal preparation, exactly what space food development optimized. Nutrition research conducted for space programs, particularly studies of how to maintain bone density, muscle mass, and immune function during long missions, has informed clinical nutrition for bedridden patients, elderly care, and recovery from illness. The emphasis on nutrient density, packing maximum nutrition into minimum volume, has influenced everything from energy bars to hospital food to military rations. Food safety standards developed for space food, requiring absolute absence of pathogens and comprehensive stability testing, have raised standards in commercial food production. Water purification systems designed for spacecraft, which must recycle water with maximum efficiency and safety, have been adapted for use in developing regions lacking clean water access and for emergency response to natural disasters. The space program's focus on reducing food waste. In space, every gram matters, and trash disposal is complex, has contributed to broader discussions of food waste reduction and sustainable food systems on Earth. Perhaps most significantly, the space program's evolution from viewing food as pure engineering challenge to recognizing its psychological and cultural dimensions has influenced thinking about institutional food service generally. Hospitals, prisons, nursing homes, and other institutions have gradually recognized that food satisfaction matters for outcomes, not just nutritional adequacy. The recognition that people have different tastes, that cultural food traditions matter for well-being, and that shared meals create social bonds that improve mental health, lessons the space program learned through astronaut complaints and research, have slowly transformed how institutional food service approaches its mission. Astronaut testimonials about space food provide personal perspectives on this technological evolution. Scott Kelly, reflecting on his year-long mission, described how food became a connection to Earth and to normal life. Food on the space station represents comfort, familiarity, celebration of holidays and special events, and a way to share different cultures. He particularly appreciated spicy foods and described how hot sauce and garlic became staples of his diet. Chris Hadfield, who served as ISS commander and gained fame for his space-based social media presence, described the surprisingly pleasant routine of mealtime. Dinner is when we all gather at the table, Velcro down, passing food packets back and forth, talking about our day. For that half hour or so, we're just people sharing a meal, and the fact that we're floating in space seems almost beside the point. Italian astronaut Samantha Cristoforetti, who spent 200 days aboard ISS in 2014 to 15, described the moment when fresh fruit arrived on a resupply spacecraft. We got fresh oranges, and after weeks of drinking orange-flavored powder or eating canned fruit, biting into a real orange was almost overwhelming. The smell, the texture, the burst of juice, it was like Earth had sent us a little piece of itself. Peggy Whitson, who logged 665 days in space over 3 missions, more than any other American, developed a special fondness for space station coffee and described the importance of this simple pleasure. Good coffee in the morning makes everything better, even in space. It's a little ritual that starts the day, something familiar and comforting before you go out to do a spacewalk or conduct experiments or deal with whatever challenges come up. The cultural exchange facilitated by shared meals on ISS has created unexpected bonds. Japanese astronaut Koichi Wakada described teaching his crewmates the proper technique for eating space ramen, demonstrating how to carefully add hot water and wait precisely the right amount of time before eating. Russian astronaut Sergei Ryazanskiy shared traditional Russian honey cake with his crew during a celebration, explaining the cultural significance of this dessert. American astronaut Kel Lindgren, who spent 5 months aboard ISS in 2015, described learning to appreciate borscht and developing a taste for Russian foods he'd never encountered before flight. These cross-cultural food experiences matter beyond simple nutrition or entertainment. They build understanding and friendship among crew members from different nations, creating bonds that help the international crew function as a cohesive team. When political tensions arise between nations on Earth, the ISS crews continue to work together effectively, sharing meals and supporting each other. Food serves as a universal language and shared pleasure that transcends political boundaries, reminding crew members of their common humanity. This diplomatic function of food reprises a role that meals have played throughout human history. Breaking bread together is among the oldest peacemaking rituals, a way of demonstrating trust and building relationships. That this tradition now extends to orbit, with Americans, Russians, Europeans, Japanese, and Canadians floating together around a meal table 400 kilometers above Earth, represents a hopeful vision of international cooperation. The future of space food appears poised for another revolution as planning advances for lunar bases and Mars missions. NASA's Artemis program aims to establish a permanent human presence on the moon, with astronauts living in surface habitats for weeks or months at a time. The moon's lower gravity, 1/6 of Earth's, will allow some different food handling approaches than the zero gravity of orbit, but won't permit normal Earth eating either. Lunar bases will likely feature from proved galleys with cooking capability, refrigeration, and perhaps even small greenhouses, taking advantage of the abundant solar energy available on the lunar surface for growing fresh vegetables. Water extracted from lunar ice deposits could support both drinking and hydroponic plant growth, making fresh food production more feasible than in space stations supplied entirely from Earth. Mars presents different opportunities and challenges. The Martian gravity, 3/8 of Earth's, is sufficient that normal Earth cooking techniques should work with only minor modifications. Liquid water doesn't exist on Mars' surface, but subsurface ice is abundant and could be extracted and purified. The Martian atmosphere, though thin and toxic to breathe, contains carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and trace elements that could theoretically support greenhouse plant growth if enclosed in pressurized structures. The red Martian soil contains nutrients plants need, though it also contains perchlorate salts that would need to be removed or neutralized. Given these resources, researchers envision Mars bases eventually producing a significant portion of their food locally, growing vegetables in greenhouses, perhaps even raising fish and aquaculture systems or insects for protein, reducing the dependence on supply shipments from Earth that take months to arrive. This vision of Martian agriculture represents humanity's oldest exploration food strategy, living off the land, adapted to an alien world. The first Mars explorers will necessarily bring years of preserved food, but subsequent missions might find greenhouses and food production systems already established by earlier crews, creating a foundation for long-term human presence. Research into advanced food production for space has produced some remarkable innovations. The Interstellar Lab has developed biopods, modular controlled environment systems that can grow vegetables, edible insects, mushrooms, and fish in integrated bioregenerative cycles, where waste from one component feeds another. These systems are designed to fit inside spacecraft or surface habitats, providing fresh food using minimal external inputs. The Air Protein Company has developed technology that converts carbon dioxide into edible protein using microorganisms, essentially producing food from air, a technology that could use carbon dioxide from astronauts' breath and Mars's atmosphere. Researchers at Penn State University have developed systems to break down inedible plant biomass from crop waste using microbes, then feed those microbes to insects, producing protein that could supplement space diets. 3D food printing technology has advanced to the point where systems can create appetizing, nutritious meals from shelf-stable base ingredients, potentially providing much greater menu variety than traditional packaged foods. These printers could theoretically transform limited base ingredients into hundreds of different dishes, combating menu fatigue. Cellular agriculture companies are developing systems to grow meat and dairy products from